Okay, then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 179. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and yes, indeed, 179 is a prime number. Before I start answering questions, of which we have a moderate amount, probably more than 2 hours worth, I would like to point out that I know some of you are probably wondering, why are there no more wild type dwarf gouramis in the tank back there? Well, I've given up on wild type dwarf gouramis. It's one of my favorite kinds of fish ever since I was a kid. But the thing is, since I was a kid, unscrupulous or just not entirely responsible or competent fish breeders have inbred them so much that they're just not healthy anymore. Plus, there's a kind of dwarf gourami AIDS, some kind of lethal virus that most of them are infected with now, which is unfortunate. So I've replaced the two dwarf gouramis that died recently with pearl gouramis. And according to Grok, a pearl gourami is only 8% likely to catch the deadly virus. So we're going with that. We're going to see how that goes. Probably I should do another aquarium video in the near future, so I won't be talking about aquariums on a Q&A mainly directed towards Buddhist philosophy. But also, before I start answering, just as a kind of disclaimer, maybe, I will say that the past few weeks have just been the most, disrupting, chaotic, turmoil, upheaval kind of weeks that I have experienced literally in years, probably since just the few months after I dropped out of the monkhood. There is a disturbance in the force. So if I seem a little bit discombobulated or some such, then we can just blame it on that. I'm just a helpless victim. So, anyways, I guess we should just wade into this. And the first question is from Warm Shadow. I'm not exactly what that means, a warm shadow. Anyways, Warm Shadow says, which philosophers throughout history are most worth studying and listening to? I should add, before I continue this question, that I updated my operating system on this computer like a week ago, or a little less than a week ago, and now the sound quality software isn't working anymore. So if I sound like I'm talking to you from the bottom of a well or some such, it's because of that. Anyways, Warm Shadow says, which philosophers throughout history are most worth studying and listening to? You have said before that you think Neem Karoli Baba and Nagarjuna are some of them. Well, probably I didn't say that Neem Karoli Baba is a philosopher, because I really don't consider Neem Karoli Baba, whose picture is right there on top of the bookcase, closest thing I've got to an altar. He wasn't really a philosopher. I mean, he was more religious than philosophical. He was more of a kind of saint than some sort of philosophical sage. So, yeah, I wouldn't include Neem Karoli Baba as a list of great philosophers because he really didn't teach much philosophy. He was teaching a kind of devotionalistic religion. You know, he worshipped Hanuman, the monkey god. So, yeah, I wouldn't go to Neem Karoli Baba for any kind of intellectual philosophizing. But Nagarjuna definitely is one of the greatest Buddhist philosophers who ever lived. His only real competition, I think, would be the Buddha himself. So for any Buddhist, I think, of course, numero uno, the most important philosopher who ever lived would be Gautama Buddha. I think he would qualify as a philosopher. He wasn't just religious. You know, it's like he was a mystic, but mysticism is sort of like a common ground between philosophy and religion. You know, it's just sort of the most, what's the word, pragmatic, the most practical approach to understanding ultimate reality. And both philosophers with the philosophical temperament and theologians with the religious temperament have converged on mysticism as a way of breaking through the veil of words and images and symbols. But aside from the Buddha and Nagarjuna, like, to understand, like, who are the best philosophers to read, I mean, it would depend on what you want to, I mean, what is your purpose? I mean, if you just want to understand, like, Western civilization, you just want to understand the culture, you've got like a sociological reason for studying philosophers, then, I mean, like in the West, Aristotle and Plato, I mean, that would be two of the most important ones, plus maybe like Francis Bacon, who sort of started the scientific method, that kind of thing. And then, of course, the early scientists were all considered to be natural philosophers. Like Isaac Newton was considered to be a philosopher. He was just a natural philosopher, which has come to be a scientist. Likewise, if you want to understand Chinese culture, then probably the most important philosopher to study would be Confucius. But let's say you're studying philosophy for the sake of increasing your own wisdom, like improving your understanding of reality, then personally, I think the most important philosopher you could read, for starters, would be David Hume. Partly because David Hume, he's easy to read. He originally wrote in the English language. Of course, it's like 18th century English, which makes it a little tougher. But still, I mean, he's easy to read. Like his Enquiries, he wrote two of those, Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. They're relatively short, it's like 100 pages maybe. And it's relatively straightforward. And I mean, he's a good person to start with, David Hume is, because he was like a radical skeptic. He was questioning things that it hadn't even occurred to philosophers to really question for the most part. Like cause and effect. Cause and effect was just accepted just as a given. It was just axiomatic. And then David Hume says, well, wait a minute. It's like, how do we know? So, yeah, David Hume would be a good one because he's sort of like just sort of clearing the field, just throwing everything off the table and just starting fresh in a way. But David Hume was not perfect. I mean, he had an axe to grind against Christianity, and he would be making digs at Christianity throughout his books. In fact, one of his books, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion or something like that, I can't remember the title of it. He made sure that was published posthumously because that was just like an attack on Christianity. He was a member of what is called the Enlightenment, which was an intellectual movement of like the 1700s. And one of the purposes of the Enlightenment was to replace superstition, which mainly meant Christianity, with rationality and philosophy, which mainly meant, or it came to mean, like materialistic science. So I don't think the Enlightenment was entirely a good thing. Maybe more good than bad, at least not more bad than good, but still there is that. Another philosopher that would be useful for Westerners to read would be George Berkeley. And George Berkeley just hammered away at one point. It's like his contribution to Western philosophy and like Western thought boils down to just one point, and that was he just pounded away at the idea you cannot prove that physical matter really exists. And two of his books, the three dialogues, and I can't remember the title of the other one. I mean, that's all he's doing is just pretty much dismantling this idea, just undermining this idea that physical matter certainly obviously exists. I don't think that Berkeley was right in his substitute for materialism, which is what he called immaterialism, which was the idea that all that exists in the universe are minds and perceptions. And that there's like this central mind called God that is just like, what do you call it, organizing managing all the perceptions of all the other minds as though there is a physical universe. So, like, if you see an apple on the table, I mean, according to Berkeley, there really is no apple and there really is no table. It's just that God is implanting into your mind this dream, sort of like the matrix of an apple on the table. And I don't really think that that's the way it works. But still, his arguments against the certainty of like the existence of a physical world out there should be considered, even if you wind up rejecting his arguments. Another important philosopher would be Kant, who was inspired by David Hume, and David Hume, in turn, was in part inspired by Berkeley. Kant says that reading David Hume, it awakened him from his dogmatic slumbers. And David Hume is good for that. But with regard to other philosophers, I mean, Spinoza's kind of interesting. Kant is important, although he's extremely difficult to read. So you might do better just to read about Kant than reading Kant directly. Read some, like a history of Western philosophy, or like just some compilation of essays about the most important philosophers. And then, I mean, your own intuition will guide you as to what it is that you need to study up on, what you need to learn, what you need to hear. So that would be a good start. Just read like Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, even though Bertrand Russell was in kind of a bad mood when he wrote that book, partly because he wrote it during World War II. But you read a book like that, and then it's like certain philosophers, and not everybody's the same. It's not going to be the same philosophers for everybody, but certain philosophers are going to like really like strike a chord, like intuitively or just intellectually or whatever. You're just going to think, yeah, that's important. I need to study that. So for some people, it might be like Leibniz. Some people, it might be Rene Descartes, although I think Rene Descartes' philosophy is pretty much obsolete at this point. Or you could get into like German idealists, that kind of thing. So let's see. With regard to Eastern philosophers, Shankara, I mean, he'd be important. He was pretty much he's one of the founding fathers, if not the founding father of Vedanta philosophy, like Advaita Vedanta. So he would be important. With regard to Chinese philosophers, I mean, the Tao Te Ching, the Zhuangzi, those would be important, like at least from a Taoist point of view. But yeah, I think your best bet with regard to a question like this is just read like a survey of Western philosophy or Indian philosophy or Chinese philosophy, and then just whatever calls to you, whatever just intuitively strikes a chord with you, that's something that probably would be good for you to study, because it won't be the same for everybody. But with regard to Buddhism, of course, Gautama Buddha is numero uno, and maybe Nagarjuna second, even for non-Theravadins. It would be important for a Buddhist to be familiar with the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka, just because, in my opinion, he lays out like the most sophisticated, elegant, and probably correct interpretation, philosophical interpretation of Paticca Samuppada, or dependent core rising, conditioned genesis, if you will. So let's see here. Yeah, we can just dismiss somebody like St. John of the Cross, who wrote a lot of deep stuff, but again, he's more religious than philosophical. So a lot of the religious writers, especially in the West, I mean, it wouldn't really qualify so much as philosophy. It's more religion. In the East, there's not so much of a separation, or in ancient times, there wasn't so much of a separation between philosophy and religion. But in the modern West, it has, I mean, religion is sort of like the artistic temperament, and philosophy is more the scientific temperament kind of a thing. So anyways, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Scudamane. And Scudamane says, would spanking your children cause negative karma? Sometimes this seems unavoidable in my life, having rambunctious little boys who sometimes get wild and often words don't seem to process for them. I would never spank one of them if I was feeling personally annoyed or angry at them. However, there are times when I will say, listen, guy, if you elbow drop your brother one more time, I'm spanking you, and you're going to your room. Oh, he has it Y-O-U-R instead of Y-O-U apostrophe R-E. I've got radar for that. Anyways, he says, listen, guy, if you elbow drop your brother one more time, I'm spanking you, and you're going to your room. I've told you several times to stop, unquote. Sometimes they seem delighted for that trade. I'm talking little kids like 3 and 6, although sometimes their mom could use it too, and she's 34. Well, again, this is like a standard template for a question that Westerners ask me. It's mainly Westerners that ask me questions anyway at this point. But, is some sort of physical activity good karma or bad karma? And it's again and again and again, I say it's not the outward activity. Just a mere physical action is ethically neutral, regardless of whether you're saving someone from drowning or deliberately causing them to drown. We'll just take out deliberately because that's a mental state, but just the physical action itself is, it's no more ethical than an earthquake or a storm or whatever. It's just a physical event. The actual ethics, whether it's a wholesome or unwholesome act, depends on the mental states. Why are you doing it? What are you feeling while you're doing it? So, spanking your children, Scudamane here specifies that he doesn't do it as a way of like venting anger, which is good. Those are the worst. Some of the worst parents are the ones who are just like taking out their frustrations by beating their kids. And sometimes they'll justify it. They say he was misbehaving and spoil the rod, spare the child and all that. But really, they're just taking out their own frustrations by beating on somebody. And in this case, it's like a helpless little kid who can't really even defend himself. But, just living in the world is going to involve a certain amount of unwholesome karma. You can't just completely avoid unwholesome karma. Especially a lay person, you're living in the world. Even delusion is unwholesome. Just to take everything at face value, to consider it reality, at times when you're not being philosophical, that's still unwholesome karma. To have preferences, to be bothered by something, to like one thing better than another thing, all of that ultimately is subtly unwholesome. So, you can't just avoid all unwholesome acts, especially if you're living in the world. You've got responsibilities. Your kids come home from school with lice in their hair. You got to do something about that. You can't say, well, I'm not going to harm the poor lice. It just doesn't work that way. So, spanking your children could cause a certain amount of negative karma, but it's like, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's the golden rule. So, in the long run, disciplining your children in a way that actually works, that a 3-year-old can understand, you can't just explain, abstract concepts to a 3-year-old as to why he should behave in a certain way. Maybe sometimes that'll work, kind of. But little kids, it's like stimulus response theory. They'll avoid unpleasantness and gravitate towards pleasantness. So a good parent will have to punish his children sometimes, and probably more importantly, to praise and reward his children when they do good. I think some parents just kind of ignore that aspect. You punish them when they're bad, but you don't praise them when they get good grades or when they do something good. They help you around the house without even being asked, that kind of thing. So, yeah, if you have kids, I personally, if I had kids, I would probably spank them sometimes, even though you might be taking a karmic hit by doing it, but still in the long run, you may be causing less suffering. It may be like the lesser of two evils in a sense, because you just don't discipline your kids effectively, so that they just grow up irresponsible and spoiled and just don't give a shit about what other people think and so forth, in a bad way, not in a good way, then, I mean, that's even worse. So, I mean, when you had kids, you're probably creating some unwholesome karma through the act of impregnating the female, so to speak, because there's lots of like wallowing in sensual pleasure when that kind of stuff goes on. So, I mean, you just cannot just be completely pure of any unwholesome acts. Because, I mean, you can't be completely pure of any unwholesome mental acts until you're fully enlightened. Until then, it's just going to be shades of gray. So, yeah, I guess I answered that question. Yeah, maybe sometimes it might even be appropriate to spank your wife. But I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rolling Clouds. And Rolling Clouds says, my question is this. And then he continues. Would you please talk about the unhinged aspects of being a monk? You've spoken about your old shitty roommate. He seems unhinged, sloppy. Did you witness any fights? Any like violence or criminal activity that comes to mind? Please, I'm interested in that angle. And then after he asked that question, I asked him, I asked him what he was referring to with regard to my old shitty roommate. Old shitty roommate, because I didn't recall ever having an old shitty roommate as a monk, or even as a layperson, really. So then he said, you have mentioned an aggressive monk in the past whom you lived with, I think. I called him a shitty roommate. Sorry. Yeah, there was one monk who tried to take over the monastery that I was senior monk at. And I've written about that somewhere. I don't know if it's still online. I've mentioned it a few times, where there was this village monk who just kind of moved into the monastery. I didn't want him to stay there, but he just kind of eased in. And what I told the other monk who lived there, who was older than me, but senior or junior to me by just a matter of months, I think. Technically, I was senior to him. I told him I wanted to kick this monk out, and he looked at me with this serious look and said, let's see, what did he say? It's like, he is my brother, something like that. And I mean, the age difference between them was such, it was like at least 30 years between them, that I didn't think he could have really been his brother. But in Burma, sometimes, like a distant relative, you'll declare to be your brother or sister, or even just close friends. They're very family oriented in Burma. Burmese villagers, very family oriented. And so they'll just adopt people into their family. And so that kind of restrained me from kicking him out. But he obviously did not follow the rules of monastic discipline. He'd just be picking mangoes at the monastery and just preparing his own food with it, that kind of thing. He handled money, this sort of thing. So finally, I just told the old monk that was the other monk there, that monk, I just want to kick him out. I just don't want him living here. And we did have a kind of a rule between the two of us. There was only two monks living at that monastery usually, that both of us would have to agree if another monk was going to stay there. It's like either one of us had the power of veto, with regard to accepting like a newcomer monk. So when I told him that, his face just lit up because he didn't like him either. It was just kind of like this. I guess they were like distant cousins, or he was a nephew or something. So then I went to that monk who, this old monk that I had just told that to was hard of hearing. You had to just yell in order for him to hear anything. So the other monk, the newcomer monk that I wanted to kick out, was easily within earshot. And he's like pretending to read a book. And I told him, well, we've decided that you have to go. And he just said, I'm staying. He didn't even look up from the book. I'm staying. And he was trying to take over the monastery. So I said, no, you're really going to have to go. And I don't remember the exact dialogue between us, but at one point he just said that you are the visitor here, because I was a foreigner, I wasn't Burmese. And then finally he just kind of dismissed me. He just kind of waved his hand and like, just go. And he wasn't even looking up. He's still pretending to read this book. It's like I wasn't even important enough for him to look up, even though I was senior monk there. And he should have looked up a few times instead of pretending to read the book, because I was starting to really get, there's a couple times when just like reflexively, I started to like lunge at him and just caught myself. I was like obviously getting irate at this monk, until finally when he just dismissed me, just go. It took like all of about 1 second. I just grabbed him by like the front of his robes and just slammed him to the ground like an enraged gorilla or some such. And then I just stomped off to the well to fill a bucket of water or something. By the time I get to the well, which is like 100 feet away, I turn around and look, and he's still like lying on the ground. I guess he got a lump on the side of his head the next day from when his head hit the ground. But then, he still refused to go. Oh, wait, I gotta plug in the computer just a second. I kind of figured I forgot something. Always forgetting to plug in the computer. Because I gotta move the computer from one place to another and the cord doesn't reach. Okay. Down to 8%. So, anyways, he still refused to go even after I slammed him to the ground. And, he's like walking around behind me at the monastery, like clapping his hands really loud, trying to make me jump or intimidate me or something. And I was really at wits end. How do I get rid of this troublemaker monk? And I'm just like pacing back and forth in my cave like a caged leopard. And then finally, it just dawns on me. Before it dawns on me, I'm thinking, am I really going to have to beat him up to get him to leave? I'm just, these crazy thoughts are entering my mind. I can like get him into a double hammerlock, maybe dislocate his arms and fling him into the river, which the monastery was right on the banks of the Chinwin River. And I'm thinking, he might drown, But then it just dawned on me. It's like, all I got to do is just appeal to the villagers. My supporters, my friends, I need your help. And so that's what I did when I went for alms round the next day. I just explained the situation, and there was some gasps of horror from the nice village ladies that offered me food every day. And they just said, "Don't worry, venerable sir." And they just went to the village headman. In fact, they went to both village headmen. There were 2 villages nearby. And so a little later that day, it was like 2 village headmen, and there was like some village elders and also some young bucks, just in case any manhandling was required, show up at my monastery, and they say, "Don't worry, we'll take care of it." And then they just went down and threw him out of the monastery. Oh, that was great. After that, I was just cackling, like, how could it have turned out to be this easy? I was just kind of at wit's end. Just how do I get rid of this monk? Because he really was just kind of a troublemaker and didn't follow the rules and this kind of thing. But getting back to Rolling Clouds' question, unhinged aspects of being a monk. Let's see. Did I witness any fights? That was the only fight between monks I witnessed. It was the one I participated in. And like I said, it lasted about 1 second. Just lunging and grabbing him and just slamming him to the ground. But I remember one time I went to the Mandalay City morgue to observe an autopsy. And the coroner told me in confidence, kind of like in a conspiratorial voice, that there was a monk that was brought into the morgue, a deceased bhikkhu brought into the morgue just recently, and it was the coroner's opinion that he had been deleted by another monk, and that the Mandalay area is notorious for just really kind of rotten, unscrupulous, unconscientious monks. But the thing is, I was a relatively conscientious one, And so I just tended to avoid, like lax monasteries. I went to the strict places with good reputations. And so when you do that, of course, you don't see all this stuff. But you stay at like some school monastery in Mandalay, or just a lot of just really lax, just sort of village monasteries where the monks really aren't striving for enlightenment or practicing meditation. They're just like secular priests to the village and just like masters of ceremonies, essentially. They're doing the ceremonies that are required by the Buddhist culture, and they're getting fed, and then in the afternoons they'll sit around and smoke cigars and drink tea with the old village guys who come and talk to them, that kind of thing. So there was some of that would happen, but I mean, I just avoided places where it was likely to happen. I had one friend, an American monk who lived near Mandalay. He lived at the base of Sagaing Hill at some school monastery, relatively famous one. And there was like a junior Seattle, like a lieutenant abbot there, who was getting his legs massaged by nuns. And that's a no-no. Monks aren't supposed to do that. And so this American monk, I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, it's been several years since this happened, I'm pretty sure that he told me that he actually went to the abbot and said, this is what I have seen. It's not good. And so the abbot, sort of chastised or scolded this lieutenant abbot who was having his legs massaged by nuns. And so this lieutenant abbot at a later time just kind of marched up to this American monk, and this, like a lot of monks, they'll have like a sitting cloth over one shoulder. You just carry it around with you. He just kind of, or it was his double robe or something. I don't remember, but he had some sort of like textiles over his shoulder, and that lieutenant monk was pissed off at him, just went and just grabbed it and flung it to the ground. That kind of thing. I mean, that was about as close. I mean, sometimes, I think it was that same monastery, and also one monastery where I stayed at before, where novices, little kid, like junior monk kind of, they're not fully ordained, but they're ordained as novices, in lesser orders, as they would say in Catholicism, that sometimes they would get like beaten as punishment. There was one little pothudo, which is even below a novice. They can still handle money. They only have to keep 8 precepts. They wear white robes. And so I stayed at this one monastery that had pothudos like that would handle the money. They weren't very good at it, but this one pothudo, he took some money to go buy some rubber bands for one of the Seatos. And instead of buying the rubber bands, he just went to a movie and spent the money on the movie. And then, knowing that he would be punished when he got back, he just ran away. And the monks were out looking for this little kid, this pothudo, this little white-robed monastic with a shaved head who was like, 6 years old. Finally, they find him living under a bridge with some hobos. And so they haul him back to the monastery, and they send him to his mother, and his mother was a nun. I mean, she had the kid before she became a nun. But when she became a nun, she figured, well, I want my son to become a monk. So she just sent him to the monastery, even though he didn't want to go. He just wanted to be a kid. So I was told that after he got sent back to the convent where his mother lived, that the mother superior, the abbess of the convent, tied him to a pole and just like whipped him. So that kind of stuff can happen. And there's another case that I should mention. I've mentioned this before, that I lived at a big school monastery near Mandalay. It had a reputation for strictness. It had one of the best reputations for strictness of all the school monasteries in Burma, but still it was like 10% of the monks really tried to follow the rules. Like 10% of the monks didn't handle money, for example. So anyways, there was this monk from a different school monastery that was sneaking into our monastery, Mahagandhayon, and stealing valuable books when all the monks were like assembled in the congregation hall to do ceremonies. So like on Uposatha Day, all the monks at the monastery would go and meet in the congregation hall, and then this monk from a different monastery would sneak in and steal valuable books, and then he'd like sell them on some monk black market or something. So technically he wasn't even a monk because he was a thief, Once you steal something that is valuable enough for you to be arrested for it, that's it, you're excommunicated for life. So he was parajika, he wasn't really a monk. So there was like an assistant Seattle, like a lieutenant Seattle in my area of the monastery, who was kind of a macho monk. There are macho monks out there. And so he just deliberately didn't go to the ceremony one day, and he was lying in wait for this thief. And he caught him, and the thief got arrested, defrocked, all of that. And then it was like weeks later, some friend of this defrocked thief monk snuck up behind this macho Lieutenant Seattle and hacked him in the back of the head with a machete. And it kind of glanced off the side of his head, but I mean, his ear was kind of peeled away from his head. He was in the hospital for quite a while. And that kind of stuff happens, especially like around Mandalay, big cities, but also you just have, I mean, in the villages, the monks are lax also as a general rule. Most of them are lax monks. Like maybe 2% of the Burmese Sangha doesn't handle money and really does try to follow the rules correctly. But they tend to be like non-violent lax monks. They're easygoing, nice guys. They just are following the tradition of their country rather than following the sacred texts. So this kind of stuff can happen, but it's pretty easy to avoid it by just going to strict monasteries with serious, strict abbots and serious, strict monks that follow rules, and you just don't come across that kind of thing. But some monasteries, especially in the cities, and school monasteries in particular, like Buddhist universities, have a reputation for being snake pits. So, I might as well also mention one Lieutenant Seattle at one of the big famous meditation centers in the Mahasi tradition in Rangoon. He traveled a lot because he was relatively famous. He spoke English well enough that he could, be invited to international meditation centers and lead meditation retreats and give discourses and so forth. But what he was doing was he was exchanging Burmese currency for US dollars on the black market, which arguably would be a parajika offense. It's tunka gata parajika, I think it's called. Is that it? Tunka gata? But it means like evading like customs duties and other government fees by smuggling something across borders. That is a kind of theft. Where you're stealing from the government by evading like custom duties or like legal exchange rates, that kind of thing. I think some people would say he wasn't parajika. He certainly would have denied having excommunicated himself in such a way, but that kind of thing happens also. Anyways, I'm moving on to the next question because I can't spend 20 minutes on each question because the file will be too big even to load. So anyways, the next question is from Jimmy Lad. And Jimmy Lad has little headings for his questions. And the first heading for the first question is Kantian inspired Dharma. And I think I might need a drink. So I'll take the little paper umbrella out of the beverage. Okay. Kantian inspired Dharma. I think this is only like the third question. We're already well over half an hour into this. Jimmy Ladd says, I have been reflecting on using the Kantian or transcendental idealist foundation to Dharma, the idea you have spoken of about how silencing the mind and application of the 12 categories of transcendental apperception would be something analogous to the process of meditation in Western philosophical terms. But I mean, if meditation is about silencing the mind, wouldn't Avicenna's senseless or floating man in sensory deprivation find it easier to be enlightened, since all the categories of his transcendental apperception would be numb? Avicenna says that such a being would at least still know it exists, so it seems that even in such a state and in meditation, there still remains the pre-conscious knowledge or presupposition that I exist. I don't necessarily mean to detour into discussion of anatta, or no self. I just mean that even in sensory deprivation, we presuppose some kind of object of existence, since we are not existence per se and would still be mortal and finite. So even in this Kantian model, we can't escape this category of baseline existence. Well, simply being in a state of sensory deprivation is not the same as doing like deep jhanic meditation. I mean, you just take Joe Schmo, you take some criminal, throw him into a solitary confinement. He's not going to become enlightened because he still has an unenlightened mind. He still has unenlightened habits. Meditation is more a method of, first of all, you remain wide awake while at the same time like undermining these mental delusional habits, but just not feeding them, not reinforcing them. So, I mean, just throwing somebody into sensory deprivation obviously is not going to cause them to become enlightened. It's more likely to cause them to go insane because they still have these anusias or latent tendencies. They still have these karmic habits of needing stimulation. So let's see here. Yeah, I mean, you got to bear in mind that even if you stop thinking in meditation, if you're meditating correctly, where your mind just becomes silent, you don't go into a coma, you don't become unconscious. You're wide awake. And then if anything starts to arise, like a desire to think, you just note it and let it go. Or, I mean, you might even be beyond the stage of even needing to note anything. It just enters the sphere of perception and just fades out under just the bright light of just awareness. So it's very different, seems to me. But it's kind of a long, complex kind of question here. Let's see here. What's the actual question? Where is the question mark in this mass of words? Let's see, I don't even see a question mark. Okay, let's see. Oh, here's one. He says, if meditation is about silencing the mind, wouldn't Avicenna's senseless or floating man find it easier to be enlightened? No, but it's not just silencing the mind. It's silencing the mind without going unconscious. Silencing the mind while remaining wide awake. In fact, you're even more awake than the ordinary person walking down the street. It's just like awareness without boundaries, pretty much. I mean, that's sort of the goal. It might be like in calculus where you never actually get exactly to the ideal, but you get closer and closer to it until finally it's like you don't even need the system anymore. You just kind of let go of it. So yeah, a senseless person would not be the same as a person who is at the verge of enlightenment. Let's see here. Yeah, I mean, that's an important thing to bear in mind, I guess. And I'm going to just move on to the next question. And let's see here. Jimmy Ladd's title for this question is Proof of Nirvana from Kant. So the question is, if we were using Kant as the logical basis of our dharmic practice, that's mistake number one. But I'll start over. If we were using Kant as the logical basis of our dharmic practice, how do we make the jump from cessation of the application of the categories of transcendental apperception? And I do appreciate that there are a few words in that sentence with less than 4 syllables. Let's see. How do we make the jump from the cessation of the application of the categories of transcendental apperception to the integral and permanent realization of supra-individual jhanic states, and the fact that ultimate reality is a thing that not only truly is but can be attained? So far, we only have a being in sensory deprivation with an empty or objectless perception. No, that's not so far what we have. You have someone who's transcended the limits of perception. And then he continues, it seems with nirvana there is a commitment to a noumenal absolute we can't prove, and until attained, no. So there is a twofold faith of its existence and the fact that effective realization of it is possible. Two propositions I'm not sure how to prove through natural reason alone. And you're not going to prove reality through natural reason, or you're not going to prove it at all, other than possibly through your own direct experience. And even then, like William James says with regard to mystical states have two qualities. The person who experiences a mystical state, first of all, has no doubt whatsoever that what he experiences is more real than the experiences of ordinary waking consciousness. But two, the second universal quality of mystical states is that it has absolutely zero persuasive power over anybody else. So mystical states, on the one hand, whoever experiences them has no doubt whatsoever it's more real than ordinary waking consciousness, but at the same time, it has no power over anybody else. It has no persuasive ability at all, unless, of course, you're like some charismatic guru or cult leader with like the big hypnotic eyes who just speaks with a voice of authority and has weak-minded people just follow along with it. So, I mean, this first paragraph of this question is, I don't know how many people would understand it, really. It's got lots of big words in it. Very intellectually oriented. And I mean, that is one of the first mistakes that anybody makes with regard to trying to practice Dhamma correctly, is intellectualizing it. I mean, if you're just an intellectual person by nature, you got to have, you got to toss a bone to the intellect, at least enough to keep it more or less pacified. But like Ajahn Chah said, that people who approach Dharma from like a scholastic point of view rarely attain anything, because they're just locked in to this intellectual approach, which is not the approach that gets you enlightened. It's just wallowing in symbols. So, I mean, you can use Kant. I mean, I use Kant not as any kind of logical basis for Dharma practice, but just as a way of interpreting, like, kind of the purpose of meditation into Western terminology that people acquainted with Western philosophy more than with Eastern philosophy can kind of understand and say, okay, it's not just all this wishful thinking gobbledygook. There may actually be something to it. So let's see, where's the actual question mark? Let's see. Let's see, I'm not seeing a question mark at all here. See, it seems with Nirvana there's not even a question mark in this. It seems with Nirvana there is a commitment to a noumenal absolute we can't prove, although you're always experiencing it. And once you start having deeper awareness experiences, you're gonna like realize that this awareness of the absolute is always there. I mean, how far away is it going to be? How far away is ultimate reality? I mean, how far away are you from the thing in itself of your own awareness? How far is that? It's always right here, right now. And the more of a deep mystical illumination that you have or experience, the more you realize it's always there, right here, right now, always. It's just that this ego has just kind of spun off through self-reference and just thinks that it's separate from everything else. But below that, and you can have inklings of this even before you're fully enlightened, you realize that the ego is not dealing with reality. And I think I better just move on to Jimmy Ladd's third question. The title of this, or the heading, is Pursuit of an Unproven Absolute. And he says, I guess someone could ask, why should I commit my entire life for the cultivation of subtle mental states with the idea that nirvana is possible, It seems if it's not possible, I've just wasted my life trying to pursue this theoretical absolute. Well, I mean, you haven't wasted your life. There's one example I've given before, like a simile or a parable, is there's a guy with this rock in the middle of his backyard. He keeps hitting it with the lawnmower, so he decides he's going to move that rock. And so he starts going out there and tugging and pushing and doing everything he can to move that rock. He just can't move it. And so it just turns into a kind of ritual every day. He's out there just pulling and tugging and just trying to budge this thing, to get it out of the middle of his yard. And finally, after, let's say, a year of this, he just gives up. And of course, I mean, he couldn't have moved it at all, because that's just the tip of this huge rock, most of which is underground that he can't even see. So he just thinks, I wasted a year just trying to move that rock. But he doesn't realize that, I mean, he's way more muscular than he was. You know, everybody else notices it. Maybe he doesn't notice, but he's like buff. You know, he's stronger and healthier now because of trying to move that rock that he couldn't possibly have moved anyway. But the thing is, this kind of question it reminds me of, there are two of the five faculties that have to remain in balance. That is panya and saddha, or in this case, reason and faith. That if you have too much of one, you're not gonna succeed. You have too much faith and not enough reason, then you can believe anything, no matter how ridiculous it is. You know, you're just gonna be soft-headed and misled again and again. But if you have too much reason and not enough faith, you're gonna be lukewarm. You're not gonna be motivated really to try much of anything for lack of sufficient data. You're just gonna be skeptical and lukewarm, and again, you're not gonna attain anything. So you have to have a kind of balance. But even if you have faith in something that isn't possible, like maybe it's just unrealistic, you're not ripe for enlightenment in this life, but still you have faith that it's possible, so you try. At the very least, it's going to get you closer to the ideal. Even if the ultimate ideal were totally impossible, at least you're going to be purifying yourself. You're going to be a better person, more virtuous, more moral, more wise. But there is a certain amount of faith that is required. I remember I used to always think that, I mean, faith was a kind of delusion. You know, faith is thinking you know something that you don't really know. It's like belief. And I always considered myself to be more panya-oriented than faith-oriented, more reason-oriented than faith-oriented. And I would say that to Burmese, people in Burma when I was living there. And then they'd point out, well, I mean, here you are living in a cave with robes on, thousands of miles away from your home. You know, that had to be caused by something. You know, it wasn't just pure reason. And that's true. I mean, there is a certain faith that Buddhism has some truth to it. I mean, if you can't even intuitively pick up on that, then it may be that you're still at such a samsaric level of functioning that, I mean, it's like the intuition or just like sub-intellectual awareness, it's just not ripened enough yet or something. I mean, if you're just basing your practice of Dhamma on trying to, using Immanuel Kant's philosophy as some sort of stimulus to that or something, then yeah, I don't know how well it's going to work out. I mean, it can be that you can start off with kind of insufficient motives. It's like Milarepa. He got into Dharma, or like some semblance of Dharma, through a desire to cultivate like magical powers. He wanted to become like a wizard to get revenge on this evil uncle, according to his autobiography, or what's considered to be his autobiography. But then, as you practice, if you practice correctly, then you get wiser and your motives for practice get wiser. Your understanding of why you're practicing and how to practice gets wiser. And so you refine the whole approach. And I hope I sound okay without the software for making the audio sound good. Let's see here. So should I continue answering this question, or let's see. Why should you commit your entire life for the cultivation of subtle mental states with the idea that nirvana is possible? Well, I mean, you don't even have to believe that nirvana is possible. I mean, it's kind of a paradox, even if it is possible. It's not possible within the context of samsara, even though Buddhist texts talk about it that way. But still, I mean, enlightenment or nirvana is just completely off the scale of samsara, and within a samsaric context, it's just pretty much meaningless. So it may require you to get beaten over the head with something, have a near-death experience, something that has like this profound, intuitive, mystical kind of effect on you to really break loose of just the chains of intellect, so to speak. And I don't know if really that was an adequate answer to any of those three questions, but still, it's almost an hour already. So I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Siddhartha Lohachita. And he says, living in the USA, do you own any weapons? And if not, why not? So that's two questions. I got to separate this. These kind of questions are kind of nice, where it's just like this. Oh, I pushed the wrong button here. Okay. Oh, damn. Please, I'm having technical difficulties just trying to separate. Okay. So, yeah, these are nice. It's like one sentence with a question mark at the end. Simple. So, living in the USA, do you own any weapons? I do own a Glock 19, 9mm, that I haven't fired in probably 2 years at this point. It's there in next to my bed in the nightstand, just in case I'm awakened in the middle of the night with somebody breaking in. I got a woman to protect and just a home to defend if necessary. So yeah, I do have a Glock 19 9mm. Also in the house, we've got a Ruger 22 rifle that I think has been fired a total of like twice. But you don't want to use a 22 caliber rifle for home defense. And I'm not likely to ever go hunting with it. But my father was a gun collector. I got a 22 rifle on the day I was born, just as like a 0th birthday present. So I know about guns, and guns are interesting. And I mean, there is the right to bear arms in America, and you never know when it might be handy. There might be a zombie apocalypse for all you know. So yeah, I do have Glock 19. I've even considered maybe getting one or two more guns, but considering that I don't shoot them, I mean, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, where you want to shoot guns, you go out into your big backyard, living out in the country, or you just drive a few miles till you get to a logging road, go out to the end of some logging road and shoot at cans, that kind of thing. That was easy. Here in South Carolina, I really don't know where there are any good logging roads like that. We have a tiny backyard here, surrounded by other tiny backyards. And so the only place really to shoot that I know of would be going to a shooting range, which is kind of an artificial environment. And I've never actually done that. Well, I guess I did that once in Aberdeen, Washington, with a friend of mine who wanted to sight in a new rifle or something. So, I mean, the short answer is yes, I do own weapons. Have some knives too. So the second question is now moot, because it's if not, why not? And it isn't if not. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Cherzaskaziz. And I seem to remember Cherzaskaziz asking two questions, but I only see one here. So if Cherzaskaziz asked two questions, and I think there was one kind of question that was just kind of like a joke question. Maybe that was it. So I didn't bother to put that on the list. Anyways, Cherzaskaziz says, have you been somewhere to see those monks from Walk for Peace? And no, I really don't have any interest in standing somewhere and watching monks walk by. They were going to come close to Greenville, and my sweetheart wanted to go in the morning and offer food to them. But then they changed routes because the weather got too cold or something. So instead of the upstate up in the hills, they decided to opt for farther east near the ocean in the lowlands where it doesn't get so cold. And so they didn't come close to us. I mean, they were in South Carolina. It's just they changed routes because the winter was getting too cold here, I guess, up in the hills anyway. But I mean, I've seen plenty of monks, and I've been a monk. You just look in the mirror, you see a monk when you're a monk yourself. And it was, I guess they're all Thai monks. Pretty sure. I didn't notice any Western monks when I would see footage. But I didn't even hear about it until like 3 weeks ago. There was some guy at work who asked me if I was going to go see my former comrades. And I didn't even know what he's talking about. So then he tells me about how these monks are walking for peace. And I just kind of made this offhand remark. Yes, yeah, I'm sure them walking is going to end all the wars. But I mean, I'm not opposed to anyone going to see monks and so forth. I mean, it's one of the blessings in the Mangala Sutta. One of the 38 blessings is to see renunciants. And seeing a renunciant is, according to legend, what caused the Buddha himself to renounce the world and eventually become the Buddha. He saw the holy man, he saw the renunciant, and it inspired him to become like him. But I mean, I wasn't motivated enough to actually want to go on a road trip just to see some monks walk by. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Newman. And Newman says, when you said you weren't reaching the right deep meditative states after 20 years of practice, how did you progress before that wall hit? Well, I don't think I said that I wasn't reaching the right deep meditative states. Oh, maybe he means that I was reaching them at first, and then after like 20 years, I stopped reaching them. Something like that. That would be more correct. When I said I wasn't reaching the right deep meditative states after 20 years of practice, how did I progress before that wall hit? Well, your meditation just gets more and more subtle. Your mind becomes less and less active and distracting. It's hard to explain, but sometimes, like if you're meditating, you reach like a new level of meditation that's deeper than what you're used to. You start experiencing what is called piti. I think in Hinduism it's called shakti, where your body can just start like twitching and like almost vibrating. It's like your muscles are just twitching from this excess energy because you've reached this more subtle mental state that uses less energy. It's like your brain is using less energy. It's less active. It's just sort of clear and still. So this energy that usually was being used up by thinking and so forth, it just has nowhere to go now. It's not used to this. And that, in my opinion, can cause feelings of like rushes of euphoria and excitement, which can derail the meditation, or just like muscle twitches and that kind of thing. And so I just stopped breaking new ground after, around the year 2004, 2005, something like that. I just stopped progressing. My meditation just didn't reach any new stages. It didn't get any quieter. And I never really was able to master it. It would come and go. So how did I progress before that wall hit? Well, pretty much like I said, it's just your mind just gets into subtler and quieter and more still mental states where your awareness is just like more luminous, I guess you could say. But then you get used to it, and it's just, not only do you get used to it, but in my case, it was like I just did not get into that deep of states anymore. It was like backsliding for whatever reason. Every once in a while you just get a little glimmer of it, but nothing like in the year like around 2003, where consistently for months I could just sit down at least once a day for like at least an hour, just not thinking, just wide awake, just still more conscious than usual, and like the mind is just clear like glass. I mean, there's more to it than that. I mean, you can't really put it into words. But it's really hard to explain stuff like this. Not only did I stop getting into more and more subtle mental states, but like the most subtle mental states that I had attained, I wasn't able to get there except very rarely after that. So I'm just going to move on to Newman's next question. Was there some kind of insight that definitively revealed to you that you had reached your utmost potential in this life for practice? It wasn't definitively revealed to me that I had reached my utmost potential in this life for practice. It was just that, I mean, like I was saying, I just stopped making progress. In fact, I was sort of retrogressing to some degree. And I mean, when you stop, something stops working literally for several years. I mean, it's just common sense that you try something else. So, I mean, I'm still probably making progress. I would like to believe I'm still making some kind of spiritual progress. It's not the same kind that I'd be making sitting alone in a cave in tropical Asia. But, I mean, just having to learn how to interact and empathize with other beings, that kind of thing, is something that you can learn better as a layperson, than, especially if you're in a relationship, than living alone in a cave. So it's just, I've sort of changed directions to some degree, or just kind of changed tack. You know, any of you out there who know about sailing, you know, my tack has changed. But the ultimate goal, I suppose, is the same. It's just a different approach, because the old approach just had stopped working. And it was just a matter of common sense. I mean, if something doesn't work for several years, chances are you should try something different. So I'm moving on to the next question. This is from RFS. And RFS says, did you know of any Westerner who disrobed to live a lay life in Burma? What would the social status be of the newly disrobed layman in Burma? Well, this is 3 questions. Damn, we got more questions than I thought. So now I got to separate them. One moment, please. You got 3 questions here instead of 1. So RFS's first question, did you know of any Westerner who disrobed to live a lay life in Burma? Yeah, I knew one person. He was an Australian monk. He'd been a monk for maybe 14 years. And then he went back to Australia to teach Dhamma, and apparently fell in love with one of the meditation retreat organizers. And then within a relatively short time, she just kind of turned on him and just like viciously, like just dumped him and just, I mean, dumped on him also, just kind of turned against him. And then he wound up marrying a Burmese woman whose family had been living in Maeso in Thailand, which is where Rambo lived for a while, if you watch that movie. And they were, I mean, it was sort of like black market stuff, smuggling. They made a lot of money smuggling stuff between Thailand and Burma. And so he married into this very rich, almost like a mafia kind of family, Burmese. And yeah, so I think he's still married to her, but I don't think they're living in Burma anymore. Ever since the military coup thing happened a few years ago, I think they just bailed out. But he was living in Burma for years as a layperson. So next question from RFS, what would the social status be of the newly disrobed layman in Burma? Well, the newly disrobed layman in Burma, I mean, if it's a Burmese citizen who is newly disrobed, I mean, his social status would probably be a little higher than it was before, because he had been a monk. He had really renounced for at least a short time. Almost all Burmese men are monks temporarily for at least a few days in their life. It's almost like a manhood ritual. A boy is ordained as a novice. It's called Shinpyu. It's sort of like the initiation into manhood almost. So, even the king of Thailand is ordained as a monk for a short time, or at least as a novice. Just walking through the town with his alms bowl, silently begging for alms, kind of, probably with attendants and like servants and stuff with him. So the social status of the newly disrobed layman in Burma, that's just the way it is in Burma. It's like almost all men have been monks who disrobed in Burma. All the Buddhist ones anyway, most of them. With regard to a Westerner or a non-Burmese person who had been a monk and disrobed, I'm not exactly sure because, I only know of one really. And I really don't know what the attitude of other lay people would be towards him. When they just meet him, they don't know that he was a monk. And then when they hear that he had been a monk for 13 or 14 years, I'm sure they would be impressed by that. They think, whoa, that's good. So, dropping out of the monkhood is so common in Burma and Thailand that, there's no onus. What is it? There's no stigma attached to that. Unless you're disrobed in disgrace or something. You're like kicked out of the Sangha for committing a Sangha offense. Some monk. I remember the medical officer in Lamie village. I lived close to Lamie village for years. And the medical officer there had formerly been a monk, and he dropped out of love for one of the village girls, and they got married. And he's still, he's the medical officer, so that's still a respected position. Sometimes people would make good-natured jokes at his expense, that kind of thing, but it was friendly. It wasn't like vicious or hostile, nothing like you'd see on social media in the West. So, yeah, I guess I answered that question. I'm going to move on to RFS's third question. Did locals look down on Westerners who married Burmese women? Well, like I said, I only met one, and he didn't, he lived in town. I lived out in the woods. I really didn't see like his social interactions with his neighbors and that sort of thing. It would depend on the locals. Some Burmese people are kind of racist. They're Burmese chauvinists. The Burmese are the only people who can truly understand Dhamma. There's lots of Burmese people who believe that, especially the upper class college educated ones. They're very chauvinistic with regard to being Burmese. And one of the best blessings they could give somebody is, may you be Burmese in your next life, that kind of thing. But let's see. Did locals look down on Westerners who married Burmese women? I never really noticed that. I think that they'd probably consider the Westerner to be fortunate to get himself a nice Burmese girl. In the West, I knew at least a few Western men who had married Burmese women, and they were just accepted. They were kind of seen as a little bit comical by the Burmese community because they didn't really fit in. They couldn't speak Burmese very well. They didn't know the customs and all that. So they would be kind of awkward. They'd go to a religious ceremony or something. They wouldn't know exactly what to do because they hadn't been doing it since they were toddlers, that kind of thing. So there'd be a little bit of amusement. But the Burmese, as a general rule, are just very open, accepting people. They've got a lot of what would be called Christian charity, which doesn't mean like generosity, making donations. It just means accepting others for what they are. So, yeah, I wouldn't say, some of them might, some of them probably would, but most of them wouldn't. And I'm moving on to the next question. This is from Angulimala. And yeah, Angulimala asks a transgressive fourth question. And his first question is not transgressive, but it's rather long. And I think this is like a follow-up to a question he asked before with a different name. So Angulimala says, is it unskillful to do body weight exercises at least twice per week for the purpose of maintaining a baseline of functional strength and endurance for longevity? I'm not talking about 200 push ups. I'm talking about 50 push ups, 10 pull ups, broad jump for general athleticism, and a run around the neighborhood. Nothing actually fancy or excessive, things a teenager could do. All of these things train fundamental human movement patterns that we all use in our daily lives. Why would a monk do that? Because monks are humans too, with bodies that are designed to move to be healthy. I say this as a personal trainer. I just really don't think chop wood, carry water is actually enough to maintain real health, especially while aging. A rounded full body routine can be maintained with relatively little effort so long as you're not being reprimanded for it. I hope he doesn't go keto too if he's a monk. But he continues here. My final justification, I'll have more energy, clarity, and ease of movement to move through life. Therefore, studying, understanding, and living the Dhamma will become much easier. If it happens to beautify me, then great, but if not, then it should still be done for general maintenance. Also, it's proven that healthy-looking people tend to have more charisma and are generally more likable, therefore more likely to successfully transmit the Dhamma to a learner. And then he says, if I were a monk in your monastery, would you allow this based on my reasoning? And then I responded in the comments under the YouTube video that, running around the block, long jumping, wearing monk's robes, that would be considered inappropriate just from the traditional Buddhist point of view. With regard to push-ups and sit-ups and that kind of thing, if he did it in the privacy of his own cabin, of his own room or cell, then that might not be a problem. But I don't know of any monk that would go jogging. I saw a couple monks riding bicycles. They were like the really lax, unconscientious kind of monks riding bicycles, and people would just like snigger at them because they were not behaving appropriately in accordance with Burmese tradition. So anyways, so after I said that, it's like jogging and long jumps, that kind of thing, yeah, that would not be considered appropriate. But with regard to other exercises, it would depend on how cool the abbot was with regard to that sort of thing. So then he had a follow-up question. If you had your own monastery and you got to make the rules, would you allow your monks to have a basic routine? Having nothing at all besides general choring and walking seems to be just one step above total mortification. This just strikes me as like almost crazy talk. But then he continues. He says, also, calisthenics equals using your own body weight as resistance for training, push-ups, pull-up, lunge, etc. Plyometrics equals explosive exercises like jumping. Isometrics is exercising without moving, like hanging from a bar to train grip strength or just pushing one hand against the other like that. Cardio equals walking, running, and sprinting. And for many people who have had wicked injuries in the past, like myself, when even just staying on top of the degradation with rehabilitation exercises for medical reasons should be valid. I myself have a cooked left shoulder from nearly losing my arm, so doing exercises like pull-ups are massively helpful. So that's the whole question, is mainly, can he continue doing relatively intensive physical exercise and training if he were ordained as a monk? That would be sufficient for a question. You don't need paragraphs. Jogging, no. That you'd have to have just a completely lax, just anything is okay kind of abbot or monastery that would let monks just be jogging for their health. And there's one statement, I said it was sort of borderline crazy talk here. Let's see, having nothing at all besides general choring and walking seems to be just one step above total mortification. No. I was healthy. I was in relatively good shape. Walking every day. And if you're living out in a forest, one thing I've noticed is it's like the caveman instincts arise more. And for some reason, it's just like your testosterone levels go up just naturally, just roughing it in a wilderness. So that, I mean, I was in relatively good shape as a monk, even though I wasn't doing long jumps or jogging around the village. I mean, if it was that important, you'd think that the Buddha would have said something other than just walking is about the best meditation you can get. I mean, you don't need to be muscular to practice Dhamma. In fact, to some degree, it is not to your benefit to be like buff, to be sculpted, to be a Chad if you're a monk, because it's like your vitality increases, the strength of your urges kind of increases. You know, your testosterone goes up, and it's like rajasic going with like yogic language. You know, it's to some degree. I mean, physically it might be really nice, but like spiritually, it's sort of moving in the wrong direction. And to think that you're just one step above total mortification just from like staying active. I mean, it's like someone has been indoctrinated into like this materialistic thinking of, you know, sort of like some of these keto doctors. Sometimes I should just say doctors on YouTube. That, you know, it's just like they're spouting off these like enzymes and stuff that nobody's ever heard of, talking about how important they are, and it's like doing this or eating that is going to, you know, increase the levels of this enzyme nobody's ever heard of before up until maybe 6 months ago. It's just, it's mind over matter. So long as your body is healthy enough that your mind can be healthy, that's good enough. I mean, if you really do have some kind of physical, you know, debility that requires exercise, that's fine. And I do admit that after I came back to America, I did have one dumbbell, like a 25-pound dumbbell. And I did some exercises with that in the privacy and silence of my own room or the trailer I moved into. But I wouldn't be doing it out in public where people could see me do it, because that would be considered inappropriate. And if you consider like plyometrics to be more important than striving for enlightenment, where, I mean, if you can't have the plyometrics, you're just not going to ordain, well, you've made your choice. But I really don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with doing some like calisthenics, maybe not jumping jacks so much, but quiet, you know, sit-ups, push-ups, maybe get a dumbbell, lift some weights a little bit, just to keep you healthy, as you say. That's fine. But yeah, if you really have to like jog and do long jumps and that kind of thing, then, I mean, that may disqualify you from being a serious bhikkhu. Any like monastery that would allow that sort of thing would probably be pretty lax and not really oriented towards the cultivation of wisdom anyway. So I'm just going to move on to Angulimala's next question here. It says, can you talk more about Milarepa and his life? And I already mentioned Milarepa some time ago in this Q&A. I read his autobiography, which was edited by Evans Wentz. I think it was Oxford University Press, something like that. And Milarepa was a Tibetan person. I don't remember what year he lived in, but his father died and his mother was supporting his family as well as she could. And there was like this uncle that swindled them out of their property, you know, while pretending to be like the guardian of the family. You know, he just sort of took possession of their property and wouldn't give it back, that kind of thing. So the mother, being vindictive, she just kind of poisoned little Milarepa's mind against this uncle and urged him to become like a black magician, like a sorcerer who would get revenge for the, you know, just righteous vengeance against the evil uncle. So that's what Milarepa did as a young man. He trained as like a black magician. And I'm sure there are black magicians in Tibet, or at least were up until the Chinese pretty much took over. You know, there are still black magicians in Burma, for example. And so he pretty much killed his uncle and his uncle's immediate family. He generated some kind of giant scorpion or something that smashed the house that his uncle was in at the time. It was like a big feast celebrating their ripping off of Milarepa's mama, probably. But then afterwards, he had a change of heart. He had like the root of wisdom, and so that kind of triggered this realization that that's really not the way to go about it. And he became this, he was ordained as a monk after that, like a Buddhist monk, not just like a black magician, a sorcerer. He had a change of heart, a realization, and so he was ordained as some kind of Tibetan. I don't. Maybe he wasn't even ordained. It could be that because his teacher, I think, was Marpa the translator, who was married and was not a monk. So I'm not even 100% sure if Milarepa was formally ordained into a Buddhist order or not, or just became sort of like a freelance, free agent kind of Buddhist renunciant. But he went out into the wilderness and just lived alone, and he was living mainly on nettles. He was eating a lot of nettles until his clothes finally just rotted off, and he turned green from just living on a diet predominantly composed of nettles. So he was like this scraggy, filthy, matted hair, long fingernails, green being living in a cave. And so the villagers just thought he was a monster. They were scared shitless of him. He did say that once he dropped, in his autobiography, he had this clay pot that he cooked his nettles in. He dropped it, and the clay shattered, but the shell of green nettle residue still remained intact. And he wrote lots of poetry, sort of like Hanshan in China. He was sort of like a Tibetan Hanshan. And so he's mainly famous because of not just the autobiography, but also these poems that he wrote. I can't remember how many, but there's lots and lots of them. And so he's considered to be a great sage. And based on the autobiography, he definitely was very committed, just radically committed to practicing Dharma as at the deepest level that he could manage. So I think he might be qualified as a saint, even though he did kill his own uncle and his uncle's entire immediate family when he was younger. So let's see here. I can't remember. He's associated with, I think it's the red hats in Tibet. Nyingmapa, is that correct? I'm no authority on Tibetan Buddhism. Anyways, yeah, I think he is associated with the so-called red hats in Tibet. So I'm going to move on to Angulimala's third question. And this is kind of a strange one. Maybe I should just skip this one and answer the fourth one. But it says, if you had to give an answer, which modern nation would be most closely aligned with how the Buddha lived during his life? Northern India still? Somewhere else in Eurasia? Issue is that most of the ethnic peoples in modern northern India are largely not Indo-Aryan, so that would change my answer. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how like the ancestry of the people would really necessarily change how closely aligned they would be with how the Buddha lived during his life. Because, I haven't lived everywhere in the world. I'm not closely familiar with every single culture on earth, but based on my experience that, like living in rural Burma, a villager in rural Burma comes about as close as you're going to find to the way people were living in the Buddhist time, or like how Buddhists lived, shortly after the Buddhist time. You still have, things are changing fast in Burma now. Like most villages are starting to get electricity. Most people have cell phones now. But when I was living there, like in the 90s and the aughts and the teens, in the teens, it was the Chinese motor scooters and cell phones and internet and electricity to the villages. It was starting to become pretty common. But before that, before like 2011, it was still, people were living pretty much the way people were living in the Buddhist time. They'd have radios flip-flops, a little bit of electricity based on like their own generator that they would use mainly for just charging batteries, that kind of thing. But the men would still take their team of bullocks out to the fields to plow. The girls would still be carrying clay pots on their head to the well or the river to fetch water for the shack, that kind of thing. And they're just devout Buddhists who take Buddhism seriously. It's not like Western Buddhists who just kind of tack it on to an ordinary secular life. Just add some Buddhist flavoring to just a standard American secular lifestyle. They're just born and raised. They're immersed in Buddhist culture from the time they are born. So I would guess that it's probably like rural Burma. I don't know what it's like in like northern India. Some areas of northern India might even come closer. I don't know. But it's sort of the lack of wealth in Burma keeps them, closer to a pre-modern standard of living and pre-modern lifestyles. Whereas in India, probably it's, India is not an extremely rich country, but at least, they've got more development going than the rural areas of Burma. So I guess I answered that one. And the transgressive fourth question is talking about Indo-Aryan Scythian origins of the Sakya clan. And that's just conjecture. And it's largely based on the resemblance of the word Sakya, which was the Buddha's own clan or ethnicity, with the word Scythian or Saka. And the Sakas did invade India later on too, like around 1 or 200 of the Common Era, something like that. So that's just conjecture really. It is possible that the Buddha had essentially Scythian origins that spoke like an Iranic language. And then they just kind of, they would have probably moved in relatively early on and just sort of got absorbed into Vedic culture to some degree. They were still living on the outskirts of Vedic culture, which I think it was like Richard Gombrich in 1 or 2 of his books pointed out that that's one reason why the Buddha didn't just become like a Hindu sage, that he just kind of established his own tradition, because from the beginning, he was on the outskirts of Vedic tradition, just kind of at the verge of it. And he could see it with a critical eye and wasn't just sucked into it and just decided to go a different direction, somewhat different direction anyway. But as far as I know, the name Sakya or Shakya and the words Saka and Scythian, there's enough of a superficial resemblance that at least it seems plausible to me that the Shakyas or Sakyas of the Buddha's family were related to Scythians. And I'm just moving on to the next question. This is from Fred. And Fred says, can we have your ideas on what spirit is? What is the container for karma and fruition seeds? So that's 2 questions. Continually having to separate. We've got more questions than I originally counted, because sometimes you got this block question that turns out having like 2 or 3 different question marks. So Cred says, can we have your ideas on what spirit is? And asking what spirit is like asking a physicist what energy is. In a way, it's like the fundamental essence of the universe. In my opinion, I do think that the entire universe is just pervaded by consciousness. So in that sense, it's just, spirit is just consciousness, or just in a way sort of like mental aliveness. But a lot of physicists, they can't really define energy very well. It's almost like an undefined term. You have to start somewhere. You can't have an infinite regress of definitions. This term is defined in these words, and these words are defined in those words, and those words are defined. It would take an infinite regress. Eventually, you have to wind up with some kind of circular definition, unless you just start with undefined terms. And like energy in physics is kind of that way, and spirit or consciousness in, I don't know, my metaphysics, I guess, would be similar. So it's just sort of like the essence of, gosh, it's the uncarved block of marble, I guess. But that's like in the absolute sense. But then when spirit gets so convoluted and self-reflective that it starts just identifying with itself and considering itself to be separate from everything else, that's a different kind of spirit. That's like samsaric, delusional kind of spirit. So it's sort of like in some like quantum physics, they have this idea that, you know, empty space can be said to contain infinite energy. So that would be sort of like the first kind of spirit in the absolute sense, but then like manifest forms of energy, like electricity running through this computer, that would be like the samsaric, you know, formed, not formless, but like manifest kind of energy. And that would be sort of like a thinking mind or mental states. It would be that kind of spirit. But it's very difficult to define something like that. I mean, it's just sort of like the ultimate fundamental essence, which, I mean, it doesn't really rely on anything before it, in a sense. Maybe you could say it's like Hegel's pure being, which is indistinguishable from pure non-being, which again is like paradoxical, and it just doesn't work trying to just explain it in a really clear, like intellectually valid manner. So I'm just going to move on to Fred's next question. What is the container for karma and fruition seeds? I mean, karma, I mean, it's its own container. You don't really need a container. And it looks like I'm starting to lag. It's unfortunate. Although at least the battery is back up to 58%. So, I mean, it's like, I was thinking earlier, it's like you turn on the faucet at the kitchen sink and the stream of water comes down in this coherent stream. So what's the container of that? What's holding it together like that? Well, it's like the cohesive properties of water itself. And so you could say like karma, or like, yeah, karma, fruition seeds, whatever. It's like the momentum of like a stream of spirit. What's holding it together is just like the similarities and sort of like the cohesiveness of it keep it together without there having to be any kind of shell around it. You know, it's just the nature of these mental states. You know, they all have like the same theme, the same kind of flavor. So they just cohere. You know, they appear to be like this unified mass when really it's just their similarities cause them to be moving together in the same direction. That kind of thing. Now, what's the container of a flame? Well, you could say it's the fuel, I suppose. But I mean, a flame doesn't have, what appears to be the outline of the flame is not some sort of container for it. And in a way, it's just kind of an illusion. So karma is just the momentum of certain manifest aspects of spirit. And if they have the same kind of momentum, then they're considered to belong to the same being, and they appear to belong to the same being. Although ultimately that being is an illusion. So I'm just going to move on to Fred's next question. Are arahants emotionally inert? Well, like subjectively they might be. Outwardly, not necessarily. Outwardly, arahants can still apparently show emotions. I mean, if you consider Neem Karoli Baba up there, if you consider him to have been an arahant, and he, even if he wasn't an arahant, he was like just extremely abnormally spiritually advanced. I mean, he would be yelling and laughing and crying and just behaving like outwardly like an ordinary person. Well, maybe not like a totally ordinary one, but still he was acting like a human. And one reason why he was acting like a human is because he's in a human body interacting with other humans. So, like Ram Dass used to say about Neem Karoli Baba, it's like the better you got to know him, the more you realize there really wasn't anybody there. He was just like a mirror reflecting your own karma back at you. And if an arahant is like that, where there's subjectively, internally nobody there, but they're just like a mirror reflecting your own karma back at you, then there could be some emotional karma getting reflected back at you. I mean, it's like inert is kind of a good term in that it's sort of like they've got denatured emotions. You know, what they do isn't generating karma anymore. So it still has the outward appearance of emotions, I suppose, but it's just, it doesn't have like the karmic momentum or what's like the impetus to it anymore. It's like denatured. So, but if you go with like Orthodox Theravada, then yeah, even then an Arahant could still have subtle emotions. Like an Arahant can still smile. He won't laugh anymore. He won't cry, but he can still smile. That kind of thing. And it seems to me that just to function as a kind of non-robot requires like a certain amount of emotion or irrationality, even to form like webs of association and understanding things, bringing up memories from the past. You know, it's like you kind of latch onto a certain emotional flavor to it, which helps bring up the memory, what you're trying to remember, that kind of thing. I mean, I think emotion is just sort of built in to a human being, and a fully enlightened human being still has that default setting, even though it's denatured in a way. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Caveman. And Caveman says, what are your predictions about AI? Do you think AGI is a near possibility? In other words, do you think the average person could become more or less obsolete within a few decades? Yeah, I don't remember what the G stands for in AGI. Artificial something intelligence, but I assume it means like really sentient, or at least such a good mimicry of sentience that it might as well be sentient for all outward purposes. What are my predictions about AI? I mean, you really can't predict what's going to happen if the technological singularity hits. If artificial intelligence becomes more intelligent than we are, and is able to act on its own initiative, you know, it starts acting independently of people. You know, it starts like, you know, deciding, well, what that human wants me to do is not appropriate. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something else. You know, if computers start doing that, you know, they get to this level of complexity of function that they're able to just kind of defy their own inputs and just act on their own initiative. And furthermore, they're like self-improving, you know, just through what's it called, recursive self-programming. Then yeah, there's absolutely no telling what's going to happen. That it's going to be a singularity. You can't see what's on the other side of it, just like you can't see, you know, what happens on the other side of a black hole or what happened before the Big Bang. It's just, you cannot begin to predict if some intelligence becomes a billion times more intelligent than we are, as much more intelligent than we are as we are more intelligent than cockroaches or amoebas, then there's no way in hell you can predict what's going to happen. And some people just insist that couldn't possibly happen. You know, like a Burmese Abhidhamma scholar would say, no, you need kamaja rupa, and true consciousness cannot arise in a computer, etc., etc. But I don't see why not. If consciousness can arise in a blob of gray meat, why can't it arise in circuitry that sort of mimics the blob of gray meat, the circuitry of the blob of gray meat? So let's see. Do I think AGI, or sentient computers, I assume is what it means, is a near possibility? Yeah, it's a possibility. Anything's possible. So do I think the average person could become more or less obsolete within a few decades? Yeah, it's possible. It's going to depend on our karma. So we're just going to have to wait and find out, I guess. But it is kind of, I mean, it is unfortunate. It's like the AI race now is like another nuclear arms race, where even Elon Musk used to warn that artificial intelligence is sort of like the sorcerer's apprentice, or the sorcerer who's trying to conjure a demon, and he's got the pentagram drawn correctly, and he's got the holy water and the Bible and everything, but he always just forgets one thing, and the demon always manages to get out and start running amok. So even Elon Musk was warning against that. And then I remember seeing a post of his on, I think it was on X, where he's saying, well, I mean, it's still moving forwards. The AI race is happening. It's pretty much unavoidable. So he can either be a passive observer or he can participate. And so he said, well, if I participate, at least I can try and steer it in a safer direction. Make sure that the holy water and the Bible work to keep the demon contained, that kind of thing. But I mean, it's a nuclear arms race at this point. China is working really hard to get the super AI, and so the Americans and anyone else that has the ability to do it is they can't let China just develop the super AI, and we're still like living like Amish people, relatively speaking. I mean, it's just it's like the nuclear arms race all over again. And at least the nuclear arms race, I mean, people were warning that it was going to destroy us. That you had generals and other high profile people in government saying World War III thermonuclear Armageddon is inevitable. It's going to happen sooner or later. We just don't know exactly when. During the height of the Cold War, there were like bigwigs saying that kind of stuff. But we're still alive, and it may be that, I mean, this whole AI scare is another kind of flash in the pan. Not that nukes aren't still dangerous. I mean, obviously they are. In some ways, they're even more dangerous because you've got like third world countries now that have nukes. So, yeah, anything is possible. And I really cannot predict what's going to happen. I'm just willing to just keep my mouth shut, try not to prophesy on the issue, and just, accept that anything is possible and just wait to see what happens. And so I'm moving on to Caveman's second question. And Caveman also wrote or asked a transgressive fourth question. But we haven't got there yet. Caveman's second, not yet transgressive question is, what are your thoughts on Nietzsche's work? And I have to admit, I was never particularly interested in Nietzsche. That I've tried to read, I read his Antichrist, and I have to admit that Mencken's introduction to the Antichrist was more interesting to me and more readable than the Antichrist itself. I tried to read Thus Spake Zarathustra, and I was the same as what Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad, he said in one of his videos. He got as far as the tightrope walker that falls off the tightrope and breaks his leg. And that was the same as, and that's about as far as I got with it too. It's just, Nietzsche writes in two, like, it's like this weird poetic, almost surreal kind of style that I just can't relate to. If I'm going to read philosophy, I want it to be philosophical more than just kind of artistic and religious and surreal. And also Nietzsche's philosophy itself, I just, I think the main contribution Nietzsche made to Western philosophy was the idea that God is dead. It's more of a sociological thing of, how is civilization going to progress now that most people are practically atheists? And he just had this will to power idea that, I mean, it's very sort of anti-Buddhist. In fact, in Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, he has this imaginary debate between Nietzsche and the Buddha. He didn't understand the Buddha very well. That's Bertrand Russell, not Nietzsche. Nietzsche probably didn't understand the Buddha very well either. I much prefer Nietzsche's forerunner, Schopenhauer, to Nietzsche as a philosopher. Although I don't think Schopenhauer is 100% correct either. I think Schopenhauer was too much under the spell of Plato. So Nietzsche's work, I mean, I don't think the world would be really impoverished if Nietzsche had never existed. I don't think the world would be a worse place without Nietzsche in it. So, I mean, there are some admirers of Nietzsche, especially people that maybe have like a little bit of a fascistic streak, or just they like the idea of the will to power and the Superman, and sort of stratification of society with the superiors, the overmen ruling over the undermen, that kind of thing. But I mean, mainly it was just his writing style just put me off. I just could not even really get into anything that he wrote just because I just don't like his writing style. So I'm just going to move on to Caveman's third question. What percentage of monks do you think have gone at least 1 year or so without masturbating or even a nocturnal emission? And how many lay people? God. And then with masturbating, I assume he means to orgasm, not just, he means like fully spanking the puppy and not just petting it a little bit. So what percentage of monks do I think have gone at least 1 year without, or no, he says, or even having a nocturnal emission? I really can't say. I mean, Asian monks, on the one hand, most of them are not conscientious monks. And I've been told that most novices really do spank the puppy. And so if you're in the habit of it, when you're a novice, and then when you become 19 or 20 and are ordained, it's hard to break that habit once you've already got it going. So it's really hard to say. I mean, I've never really pried into this. I never wanted to find out. So, I mean, and then the not having a nocturnal emission, I mean, that really just kind of throws a whole monkey wrench into it, because in my case, I mean, it was just a natural thing. About every 2 weeks, I would have a nocturnal emission just to keep the hormones in check. You just have to overflow. And when you're young and dumb and full of like precious bodily fluids, then that can happen. I mean, it just overflows spontaneously in your sleep. But then again, like the Asians, even though on average they're not as strict as Western monks, or monks who are not born into a Buddhist culture and kind of really have a strong resolve to follow Dhamma rather than just following their culture. I mean, there's that, but there's also the fact that like Burmese monks, probably Thai monks, just East Asian monks, don't have as high of testosterone levels as Caucasians do, and Caucasians in turn do not have as high of testosterone levels as, say, sub-Saharan Africans do. So I really can't say. I mean, I would like to think that most monks don't spank the puppy. And I really never saw any evidence other than, a little bit of hearsay, like rumors and stuff. Like I had one monk, an American monk, tell me that most of the novices, teenage boys who are in lesser orders, they really do spank the puppy. And then, it just kind of like a logical progression. If you're in the habit of doing that as a novice, then just being fully ordained probably isn't just going to shut off the momentum of that. But I don't know. I think the Thais tend to be naughtier with regard to their sexual excesses than the Burmese. The Burmese are just amazingly stoic, and just, I mean, a lot of Burmese monks, they don't even particularly like girls or boys. It's like when I was living at Mahagandhayon, which is a big school monastery near Mandalay, there was several hundred monks there. And sometimes there'd be like this, this little bevy, this little cluster of teenage Burmese girls or young Burmese women dressed in their best clothes, all, their hair all nice and everything. They're walking by, and there's like a bunch of monks walking the other way in front of me, and not a single head turns. They don't even bother to look. They're not interested. Or you're driving down the road, there's a carload of monks with some layperson driving the car, driving down the road, and there's like a public well by the side of the road, and there's like 2 or 3 young women bathing there. And, they wear like a bathing sarong. They're not naked, but still it's wet, plastered to their body. And there was only one Burmese monk that I knew whose head would turn when we would drive by that. Because most of them, it's just, they're practically asexual. There was an American monk that I used to hang out with in Burma, and we had this kind of a joke. It's like, how do Burmese women even get pregnant? I mean, there's no privacy. You know, they're living in the same house with 3 kids and grandma, maybe the spinster aunt living in the same one room shack. You know, it's like maybe it's just that most Burmese children are descended from doctors or something. It's like the the mother, the woman goes to the doctor and she comes home pregnant or something. It's just weird. But in Thailand, they're definitely more sensual than in Burma. But with regard to what percentage, I mean, just ignoring the nocturnal emissions, which is not against the rules, just masturbating. I would hope that way less than half of the Sangha spanks the puppy. I mean, I would hope. And with regard to lay people, I would guess it's most of them. Unless, I mean, you're just in a steady relationship with somebody and you're sexually active and don't need to do that. But, I mean, you asked the wrong guy with regard to that question. Because really, it would just be like a wild guess. But I was a monk living among Burmese monks in Burma for more than 20 years. I was a monk for 30 years. And I just never really caught a whiff of this kind of thing. Maybe just because it's a private, personal thing and nobody shared it with me, but I just really have no data. Not just insufficient data, I have practically zero data upon which to base this. And then there's the progressive or the transgressive fourth question about dark projects happening underground, governments and corporations making human clones and human animal hybrids and stuff. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a similar question where, I mean, it would just be like a wild guess based on just hunches or, you know, imagination, just pure conjecture, because I really don't know. And it's a fourth question anyway, so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, if we have no self, then who or what gets passed on to be reborn in the next life? And that's the only thing that moves from one life to the next is karma. That's the only thing you take with you is your karma, at least according to Buddhist philosophy. And your karma is essentially volition or will in the Schopenhauerian sense. You know, it's cetana in Pali, which is usually translated as volition, but I think will, like in the sense of Schopenhauer saying the world is will and representation. So it's like samsara is volition and perception. I mean, that's essentially what he was saying. And I can get on board with that. So yeah, it's just the momentum of your mental states. That's what will is. It's habit energy. And it doesn't really need a container, like I was saying to Fred. You know, it's just like they're all, you know, the same type, the same kind of general flavor, moving in the same general direction, just maybe with a certain cohesiveness, like water molecules or something. And I mean, it doesn't really need a being any more than a flame needs a flameness entity to hold everything together. It's just, so long as the causes are there, the effects are going to be there. And if you want to eliminate the effects, you have to eliminate the cause. Just like if you want to put out a fire, you have to eliminate the causes, or at least one of the essential causes of that fire. Take away the fuel, take away the oxygen, or take away the heat. And pouring water on it essentially takes away the heat, I'm pretty sure. Because liquid water can't get hotter than 100 degrees Celsius, at least at normal atmospheric pressure. So, yeah, I mean, the only thing that gets passed on to be reborn in the next life, according to Buddhist philosophy, is your karma, which is the momentum of your mental states. It's like the kinetic aspect of your mental states. So, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Philosophers, and we've already been going for 2 hours. I hope this isn't going to be a 3.5 hour one, especially because uploading it onto BitChute means I have to reduce the size of the file because it's just too big. It can be like 8 gigs. Anyways, Philolethes says, is beverage your favorite word? And no, it is not. In the past, I've considered that my favorite word is supposedly. I like the word supposedly. Also, the word curvaceous just has this opulence to it that I like. But beverage is a nice word. Yeah. So let's see here. I'm just going to move on to Philolethes' next question. How old were you when you started making old man noises? I don't know. Probably, I was probably like in my 40s when I heard like junior Burmese monks mentioning that I kind of vocalize a lot when I'm like, grunting when you pick up something heavy, that kind of thing. But I don't know. I'm not exactly sure what kind of old man noises is being referred to here. But just kind of vocalizing when you get out of a chair, grunting, that kind of stuff. I don't know. I didn't write it down the first time I did it. So who knows? So next question. Philolethes says, thoughts on circumcision and are you? Yeah, it was just a matter of time before somebody starts asking about my junk. Seriously. Next people, it's like they're going to be asking about like length and girth or something. But yeah, I'm really not going to be describing my own genitalia on a Q&A. But thoughts on circumcision? It apparently is sort of like a Eastern Mediterranean thing originally. It's not just Hebrews, but I think like Arabs and like maybe the ancient Egyptians may have done it too. I'm pretty sure. It was sort of a Semitic and maybe Hamitic thing. And supposedly, the official explanation for it has something to do with hygiene. It's like no moist crevice. You're removing an unnecessary moist crevice that could harbor, icky substances or pathogens or something. Although I'm really not sure. That could just be like a convenient rationalization for it. I've read somewhere that the Hebrews in particular practiced circumcision as a replacement for child sacrifice. It's like the firstborn. Like in the Bible, it's talking about, you sacrifice the firstborn of your livestock. And it may have been at one time, very, very early on, maybe even pre-Moses, that, even your firstborn child would be sacrificed. Some, like the Phoenicians, they certainly had part of the mainstream sacrificing their own children to Moloch or whatever. And so it was just sort of cutting off a bit of skin was sort of like some symbolic substitute for, putting them into the brazen bull or whatever. But yeah, I will say that in America in the 1960s when I was born, it was just the common practice. It was like the default setting that most guys were circumcised. And it seems like being uncircumcised is the natural state. We did evolve that way. It apparently didn't have any like really Darwinian like negative effects on the human race. So, I assume it's largely a cultural thing having to do with Christianity and Christianity being based in Judaism, which insisted on circumcision. Although Christianity really doesn't insist upon it. Paul talks about that in the New Testament, in his epistles. So I'm really unsure of like the sociological factors and conditions that resulted in most Americans of certain decades just being automatically by default circumcised at the hospital shortly after they were born. And I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from PSA. This is a politics question. Maybe to some degree a psychological question. What do you think about your homeboy from South Carolina, Lindsay Graham, calling for Putin's assassination? Well, Lindsey Graham, he's a senator, one of the two senators for South Carolina, and he's always been a war hawk. He looks like this gay little nebbish of a guy. It's like if he put on a military uniform it would just be like laughable. But he's just like this gay seeming little nebbish of a guy who, nevertheless, he's kind of a neocon Republican who is just, he never saw a war he didn't like. You know, he just wants America to just go out there and kick ass. And apparently that involves Putin. But I mean, to me, that's just his MO. I mean, that's what Lindsay Graham does. You know, he just calls for like violent solutions to international problems because, I mean, he's just some kind of war hawk, while at the same time he might not be able to lift a rifle. It's just weird. I mean, to some degree, he's just sort of like externalizing his frustrated attempts at masculinity or something by being in favor of this military aggression at every convenient opportunity. What's more interesting to me is why it is that Lindsey Graham is still one of the two senators of South Carolina when he is almost universally despised by the Republicans of South Carolina. It was just a few years ago, Trump had a rally in Pickens, South Carolina, which was Lindsey Graham's hometown, not far from here. And Lindsey Graham was booed off the stage. He's trying to talk, and he could not talk because it was just this resounding mass of boos until he finally just left the stage. So, I mean, that's, to me, a more interesting question is why does he keep getting elected? And one reason why Lindsey Graham keeps getting elected to the U.S. Senate in South Carolina is that there are no closed primaries in South Carolina. There's a lot of outcry. We need closed primaries where only registered Republicans can vote for the Republican candidates, because you've got Democrats who know that South Carolina is deep red state. There's not going to be a Democrat taking Lindsey Graham's place. So they figure, well, Lindsey Graham is better than, you know, some like MAGA nationalist or something. So they'll vote for him in the primaries and then vote for the Democrat in the major election. And also, Lindsey Graham is just in with the Republican establishment in Washington, D.C., so he gets lots of funding. He's just got the name recognition, and just with regard to campaigning, you know, he's got all the money. And so he keeps getting elected, even though people he's just sort of like, it's hard to mention his name in South Carolina without people just hissing audibly. And I'm moving on to the next question. Gosh, how many more questions we got? We're kind of sort of getting down towards the bottom. We're well over halfway. And the next question is from Ethiopian Fake Tig. And Ethiopian Fake Tig says, after you become enlightened and you won't become reincarnated again, people say you neither exist nor are you non-existent. What does this mean? Well, again, it's like, what does completely off the scale of samsara mean? How do you explain in purely samsaric terms what is the meaning of being completely off the samsaric scale? What is wrong with this picture? It's just completely off the scale. I mean, some people who are just like completely locked into samsara, they cannot comprehend anything besides this samsaric fake reality, quasi-reality. Then how do you explain what is not samsaric? You know, if all you know is the English language, then how can you understand some other language? I mean, it's even worse than that, because when you get off the scale of samsara, it's just language doesn't work anymore. So, I mean, existence and non-existence are like a mind-generated duality. So you just transcend the duality. Let's see here. Did I answer the question? I mean, I really can't be taking 20 minutes per question. So after you become enlightened and you won't become reincarnated again, maybe. People say you neither exist nor are you non-existent. What does this mean? Yes, in the Kalaha Vivada Sutta of the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata, it's a sutta that says, you know, somebody asks, you know, what causes existence and non-existence, and the Buddha's answer is a mental state. I don't remember exactly which mental state it was, but this mental state causes existence and non-existence, because existence and non-existence are like this mind-generated duality. It doesn't really apply to the absolute, it doesn't really apply to ultimate truth. So, yeah, I mean, you have to become enlightened to understand this stuff. It's people, they ask questions, what's it like to be fully enlightened? You know, what's nibbana like? What flavor is nibbana? This kind of stuff. And it's like, you just can't answer these questions. You just talk and talk and talk till you're blue in the face. And still, I mean, the person is going to remain clueless. If you want to know what vanilla tastes like, you have to taste vanilla. Don't just go up to somebody and ask them, what does vanilla taste like? Anyways, I'm just going to move on to Ethiopian Fake Tig's next question. He says, it is said that the Buddha's kingdom, which he left, was massacred after he was enlightened, and his entire family, whom he left behind, was murdered by another kingdom. Is this true? Yeah, there is a tradition. It's in the commentaries, I think. Maybe there's like slight mentions of it in the suttas, but it was after the Buddha's time. It was after the Buddha's parinibbana. And I don't recall the exact details, and it's all kind of legendary anyway. But it was like King Ajatasattu, who was king of Magadha, if I remember correctly, which eventually became this vast empire. I mean, Ashoka was essentially an inheritor of the kingdom of Magadha. King Ajatasattu, or somebody, you know, like maybe it was the son of Ajatasattu. I mean, it was shortly after the Buddha's time. They wanted to marry a Sakyan princess, a Sakyan princess. And the Sakyas, being proud, you know, sort of proud nationalists, instead of sending the princess, they sent a slave girl. And this prince or king married the slave girl thinking it was the Sakyan princess, and didn't realize that he had been tricked and just been sent a slave girl until after the marriage, after the deed was done. And so he got pissed off, which is kind of understandable, and just genocided the city-state of Kapilavatthu. And if that legend isn't entirely true, the fact remains that Kapilavatthu, which was the city-state that was, you know, the Buddha's home, you know, his hometown, his home country, it did just get wiped off the map shortly after the time of the Buddha. So I think I answered that question. Yeah, I don't know what I would add to that to make it a more complete question, or more complete answer, I should say. So I'm just going to move on to Ethiopian Fake Tig's third question. He says, you mentioned that mastering jhana gives people superpowers. What kind of superpowers did the Buddha ever say you get from mastering the jhanas? And there's like this stock block of words that you find in the suttas mentioning, it's like the 6 abhinya. The abhinya is like, you know, like super knowledge. And like in Burmese, abhinyan, it means like psychic powers. It generally, abhinya means mainly psychic powers. And just so happens I've got Nyanatilaka's Buddhist dictionary here. So take out this bookmark, which is a call to jury duty. And here it is, abhinya. There's 6 of them. So the first of the 6 abhinya, and I think the Samanyapala Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, like the second sutta of the Digha Nikaya, goes through the list. You can look it up for yourself if you want to. But the first is, let's see, the monk enjoys various idivida, or magical powers is how it's translated here, such as being one, he becomes manifold, and having become manifold, he becomes one. Without being obstructed, he passes through walls and mountains, just as if through the air. In the earth, he dives and rises up again, just as if in water. He walks on water without sinking, not the only person famous for doing that. Just as if on the earth, cross-legged, he floats through the air, just as a winged bird. With his hand, he touches the sun and moon, etc. Yeah, I used to wonder about that one. You just, with your hand, you touch the sun and moon. That would be a tricky one. That might be one of the most difficult ones here. But I mean, it's sort of like, multiplying your body into multiple bodies, or walking on water, that kind of thing. That all counts as one psychic power. 2, he has the Diba Sota, or the divine ear, and it's like clairaudience, I think would be like the English technical term for that. He hears sounds both heavenly and human, far and near. So the 3rd one, he knows the minds of other beings by penetrating them with his own mind. So I won't read the entire paragraph, but essentially it's mind reading. You know the minds of other people. 4, he has Diba Chakut, the divine eye. So, let's see. Essentially, it's clairvoyance. The pure one, he sees beings vanishing and reappearing, low and noble ones, beautiful and ugly ones, sees now beings are reappearing according to their deeds or their karma. So, let's see, 5, the 5th one, he remembers manifold former existence, so he remembers his past lives. And then 6, finally, through the extinction of all asawas, or encumbering influences, even in his very life, he enters into the possession of deliverance of mind, deliverance through wisdom, after having himself understood and realized it. So the highest of all the psychic powers is simply becoming enlightened and knowing that you are enlightened. So the first psychic power is just being able to levitate, walk on water, walk through walls, that kind of thing. Second is the divine ear. You can hear stuff that ordinary people can't hear, including, conversations going on in heaven, that kind of thing. 3, you read minds. 4, you are clairvoyant. You can see events happening far away. And also you see people like dying and being reborn in accordance with their karma, that kind of thing. And 5, you remember your own past lives. And 6, you are aware of your own enlightenment. And we've got vertical stuff going through the blinds hit me in the face again. And anyways, I got to go on to the next question now, because it's, in a way, it's kind of a race against the clock. I would like to be done within 3 hours. So the next question is from Bodhisattva 969. And he says, what do you think of this Buddhist march for peace through the USA? Are the leftists once again appropriating Buddhism, for example, against ICE trains and racism, because they don't know what they're talking about, or are these monks themselves leftists? Well, I already kind of discussed this in answer to a previous question. But what do I think of the Buddhist March for Peace of the USA? I mean, it's harmless. It's all Thai monks as far as I know. So, I mean, it is true that it's like leftist. I remember my sweetheart was watching a video of these monks arriving at some town in South Carolina and spending the night at a Methodist church with the Methodist Christians all, just warmly welcoming them, partly because it's like politically correct to, support, foreign non-Christians or something. I'm not sure exactly. But are the leftists once again appropriating Buddhism because they don't know what they're talking about? Or are these monks all themselves leftists? It's hard to say. I mean, Thai monks, probably they're relatively conservative. I would guess that they're more conservative than most of the American lay people of European ancestry who are supporting them. And monks in general tend to be more conservative because, of course, they're following an ancient conservative tradition. I mean, Theravada Buddhism is the most conservative school of Buddhism. And, you don't want to be progressive in your Theravada Buddhism because then it stops being Theravada pretty quickly. But the lay people don't really realize that. They see that it's sort of a fashionable kind of a system. I mean, probably most of them that are supporting these monks really don't meditate and don't know much about Buddhism. The leader of the walk, who is giving the talks to the masses, it's fairly straightforward. He's not preaching against ICE agents or anything like that. I mean, he's just giving just basic Buddhist ethics which is suitable for lay people. So the whole thing strikes me as being relatively, I mean, it's harmless. And I mean, there's probably some good. At least it's publicizing Theravada Buddhism. You know, it's kind of bringing Theravada Buddhism a little more into the mainstream by being, you know, obvious. And I don't know of any harm that it's causing. So, I mean, I don't have anything bad to say about it. I don't think that the Walk for Peace or the March for Peace, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily going to make the world more peaceful. I mean, it's not going to end any wars. These monks walking from Texas to Washington, D.C. or wherever they're walking. But I mean, they have the right to do it. And I don't think that they're doing anything bad by doing it. And probably the effect of this is more positive than negative. So more power to them, in my opinion. Let's see. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is also from Bodhisattva 969, who I believe is a German fellow who I think lives in Thailand, at least some of the time. And he says, has your opinion of Trump changed or has it stayed the same? Is it true that his approval ratings among his voters have dropped because of Venezuela and Greenland? My opinion about Trump has changed. Domestically, he's certainly good, but in foreign policy, I see it as wrong to interfere in the internal affairs of sovereign countries. Firstly, anyone can claim that Maduro wasn't elected in our democratic Germany. The strongest party, the AfD, and its voters of 26% are simply excluded. This is clearly about oil and resources. Okay, so let's see. Well, one thing I'd point out about Maduro is that it was the Biden administration that put a $25 million bounty on his head. So, I mean, Trump is just more likely to follow through instead of just bloviating and pontificating, just saying lots of words and then not doing very much. And that is one thing that people, especially on the left, and just like conservative establishment Republicans, they're kind of freaked out about that because Trump is actually exercising his authority and doing shit. And I mean, not all of it is entirely popular, of course. But let's just get back to the actual question here. Has my opinion of Trump changed or has it stayed the same? And it has changed a little bit. Like this whole Greenland thing, it's like, on the one hand, it just seems like, it appears superficially to be ill-advised, to be more or less threatening a military invasion of a territory of Denmark, who is a member of NATO and presumably our ally. So it's like, why is Trump threatening to invade Greenland? I mean, he pretty much has done that. So it causes a little bit of hesitation. I'm assuming, I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt and assume that there is some intelligent method to the madness. You know, Trump is really into the art of the deal and just makes these outrageous asks and then finally settles for what he really wanted in the first place. And also, he's good at distracting attention. So he just has something blow up over here while he's getting shit done over there. So it could be something like that too. Although it certainly has made him much less popular amongst like the international community, especially this Greenland thing. With regard to Venezuela, like I was saying, it's like the leftists themselves were denouncing Maduro. The Biden administration itself put a $25 million bounty on his head. It's just that Trump being the one who took care of it is just all of a sudden it's this outrage. You know, if like the Democratic Party 5 or 10 or 20 years ago endorsed something and then Trump does it, all of a sudden the Democratic Party now denounces it as just Gestapo tactics and so forth. It's weird. I mean, it's just like the main position of the Democratic Party appears to be just oppose anything Trump does. Even if they originally endorsed it, if Trump is the one who's doing it, then it's bad. So yeah, it seems that Trump is kind of becoming somewhat of a loose cannon, although still I would much prefer Trump to cultural Marxists, just feminizing and castrating the United States and just subjugating it with some kind of socialist mommy state. If Trump wants to go Julius Caesar or Trajan, he sees that Europe is just falling, that it's just beyond repair at this point. So he's just going to take part of it, just like Putin is kind of trying to do the same at the other end. Then maybe in the long run, it's a good idea. I don't know. I really do not know what Trump and his administration know. Like Marco Rubio, he seems to be a sharp person and relatively sane. He's involved in this too. He must know what's going on. So we're just going to have to wait and see with regard to the whole Greenland thing. With regard to Venezuela, I think that was not, a lot of Trump supporters don't want involvement in foreign wars, this kind of thing. But just going in one night, snatching this guy without taking a single casualty. That was just a message to the world that American military might is back. There's going to be no more of those botched withdrawals from Afghanistan. That the American military is numero uno on this planet at present. And he was just demonstrating that. And that is from a nationalist American point of view. That can be a good thing. I have to admit, love Trump or hate Trump, he's got more cojones than any president since Theodore Roosevelt. He just gets shit done. It's like he's willing to break eggs and just tip over apple carts and all kinds of things, make waves. But it's people like that wind up being like in the history books as like great leaders, or at least very consequential leaders. And just the establishment just doesn't know how to deal with it. Their purpose is to like nurse problems and keep saying that they're going to fix it and collect taxes in order to fix it. And then they just don't do anything or just make it worse. And Trump just doesn't go that way. This is the first time in decades that net immigration into the United States has reached zero. And that's one of the reasons that people voted for him. So my opinion of Trump has changed a little bit. The whole Greenland thing especially is, seems weird to me. I don't fully understand it. I don't even understand what Trump's real motives are for doing this. But there very well could be some really intelligent method to the madness. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cyrus Frame, one of the few people who asks questions on Rumble. And Cyrus Frame says, and I'm starting to get a little bit hoarse. This is turning into a long one. Cyrus Frame says, it seems to me that much of the Buddhist canon is a corruption of what the Buddha actually said and meant. For example, in the Atthakavagga, the word nibbana is not used. Instead, the verb form nibbati or nibbayati, to blow out, is used. An equivalent word would be to extinguish, not exactly. That was my addition, my little commentarial addition there. I continue. It does not make sense to turn that word into a noun, like extinguishment, as after a fire is extinguished, the fire is gone. That is different from, for example, to judge, where after that is done, a judgment exists. I think that in the latter text, or the later texts, they took what is a process and turned it into a thing, so reified it. This later led to people feeling the need to create the two truths doctrine, in my mind directly contradicting the Buddha when he said there is but one truth, not a second, in the Chula Vyuha Sutta in the Atthakavagga. What do you think? Okay, well, there's a few things here. Let's see here. Well, when he says, it seems to me that much of the Buddhist canon is a corruption of what the Buddha actually said. Yeah, I agree with that. I wouldn't be completely outraged at a claim that 80% of it, or more than 80% of it, is a corruption of what the Buddha actually said and meant. And then he says, in the Atthakavagga, the word nibbana is not used. Instead, the verb form nibbati or nibbayati, which literally means to blow out. an equivalent word would be to extinguish. No, that's not really the same. I mean, that's just getting stuck in like English. You know, you're trying to translate just from Pali into English, and it's not a direct translation because the connotations and the meanings, the understanding of the words and everything are not the same between ancient North India and modern America. So blowing out, I mean, it doesn't mean, I mean, it's I don't want to get into the whole discussion of like ancient Indian understanding of fire. But I mean, it was like fire pervaded everything. You know, fire was the god, Agni. The fire was this immortal god. And when the fire blew out, it simply became unmanifest. It wasn't like it died. I mean, that's one way of looking at it anyway. So, anyways, let's see here. It does not make sense to turn that word into a noun like extinguishment, as after the fire is extinguished, the fire is gone. Well, I mean, you need to bear in mind that there's two meanings of the word nibbana or nirvana. There is nirvana as an ethical state and nirvana as a metaphysical state. As an ethical state, yeah, it can mean just the moment of cessation or blowing out or whatever, you know, however you want to define it. You know, that's this ethical state. It's like the moment of becoming enlightened is nibbana. But then as a metaphysical state, that's the absolute. And the absolute, especially in early Buddhism, you just did not want to go there. But it's so difficult to deal with like the goal of Buddhism or like trying to like even discuss reality without having words for it, which of course like degrades it. You know, you're sort of reifying it, dragging it into the level of samsara. But I mean, to some degree, it's just unavoidable from a philosophical point of view. And ancient North Indian Buddhists were definitely philosophical. They're having all kinds of philosophical arguments and hypotheses and debates and theories and all this practically from the get-go. So let's see here. That is different from an example to judge, where after that is done, a judgment exists. I think that in the later text, they took what is a process and turned it into a thing, so reify it. Well, even the process, even considering it to be a process would be reified. But I think what he means is that you're sort of conflating the two meanings of nirvana, the ethical meaning and the metaphysical meaning. You know, like metaphysical meaning, like in Pali, would be nibbana dhatu, the element of nibbana. So let's see here. This later led to people feeling the need to create the two truths doctrine, in my mind, directly contradicting the Buddha when he said there's but one truth. No, because the two truths doctrine is talking about conventional truth, which is all truth that can be put into words, really. And then you've got the ultimate truth, which is beyond language. And conventional truth, or worldly samsaric kind of truth, is not ultimately true. It's just accepted as true by unenlightened people, or maybe even by enlightened people, just as skillful means as a way of communicating. But really, there is just ultimate truth is the only real truth, and you can't put it into words. But then later philosophers really, you know, in order to talk about it, and what better thing is there to talk about, I guess, in the minds of philosophers is, I mean, in order to talk about it, you got to use words, which is dragging it down into samsaric language, reifying it, etc. So, yeah, when the Buddha said there is but one truth, he's referring to ultimate truth, and that is true. I mean, even to say that it's one, I mean, you're already, if it's ultimate truth, you can't describe it in words. It's just hopeless. It reminds me of the Sin Sin Ming, supposedly composed by the third patriarch of Chinese Zen Buddhism, who said, all we can say is not two. Because one and zero, sort of like in Hegel's dialectic, they just merge together. Infinity and nothing, pure being and pure non-being, they just cannot be distinguished. They're synonymous, essentially. So, what do I think? Well, I've kind of given a commentary to this. that there's two meanings of nibbana. One is just the moment of enlightenment, which is an ethical definition, and the other one is what it is that is attained in a sense. I mean, you don't just cease to exist, you don't just poof, and then there's no more you or no more appearance of you or anything like that. But again, I'm trying to describe, and I mean, it really is just like a kind of dilemma with no solution. People are just going to continue asking, what's nibbana like? And it just doesn't work. Once you open your mouth and start talking about it, you're just dealing at the level of conventional truth, which isn't ultimate truth anymore. But that doesn't mean that there is no ultimate truth, even though you cannot possibly utter it. Oh, man. It does get a little frustrating sometimes. So let's see here. Yeah, the people feeling the need to create the two truths doctrine, I mean, even they knew that conventional truth isn't really true. It's just considered true by the majority of humans. So, I mean, that's not a contradiction at all. Because even the formulators of the two truth doctrine, assuming that it wasn't the Buddha himself, they knew that conventional truth, or samuti sacha, is not the same as ultimate truth, or paramata sacha, and thus isn't really entirely true. But I do agree that, let's see, much of the Buddhist canon is a corruption of what the Buddha actually said and meant. And especially you get into Mahayana, where almost all of it is just invented hundreds of years later. This words being put into the Buddha's mouth. So if you include all Buddhist scriptures, then we'd be fortunate if 1% of it actually represents what the Buddha really said, which is unfortunate. But at least we're not lagging anymore, maybe just a teensy bit. And I'm moving on to the next question, also from Cyrus Frame. He says, my second related question regards the fact that in the Atthaka Vagga, the sage is often described as someone who does not rely even on dhammas. For example, dhammapati desam na patichitase. And that ase is an archaic suffix that is not found in regular Pali, which indicates one of the indications of the extreme antiquity of these suttas. But I continue here. Also, no philosophies are received by them. If nibbana is a thing or a category, it would be a dhamma. I understand one description of nibbana is something that is unconditioned, which is inherently without categories, but a noun by definition is a thing, and that infers categories. Yeah, I mean, conventional truth, you got to use words. But I continue here with his question. A sage would avoid the process of categorizing. Vinichyam kupadi jantu loke, which is a person makes a discrimination in the world, quote unquote, but not the sage. It seems to me that these conceptual entanglements are unnecessary and arise because of reification. What is your opinion on this? Well, if you don't reify it, at least linguistically, you can't say a fucking thing about it. See, that's the problem. Like the goal of Buddhism is to transcend the samsara, but all language and all ideas and all explanations are necessarily samsaric. So how do you explain the transcendence of samsara in 100% necessarily samsaric terms? Again, it's just this dilemma, and people just keep insisting, especially intellectual type people who are just stuck in intellect. I mean, they don't just use it as a tool. It's like they're enslaved to it. It's like a mental prison. Maybe a really comfortable one, the most comfortable one they can think of or have come across. But still, it's like a cage. And the door is unlocked, and people don't even try the door to get out in most cases. But let's see here. I think the main problem with this question is regard to the meaning of the word Dhamma. Because the word Dhamma has many different definitions, and you have to decide through context what the definition is. And I've got dhammas translated as philosophies in my translation of the Atthaka Vagga, because that's apparently what it means. When it says the sage doesn't go by dhammas, it means he's not like attached to a philosophy in his practice or in his life, in what beliefs he shouldn't have, that kind of thing. So no philosophies are received by them. That means he doesn't cling to any theories. I mean, you have to have, so long as you're not enlightened yet, especially, you have to have some kind of belief system or theories, but it's like there's a difference between holding it in an open hand as a convenient working hypothesis, and then, or else just, on the other hand, just clinging to it. Clinging to it and insisting only this is true, anything else is wrong, which is the way people generally operate, because they think that their beliefs are true, and therefore any other beliefs that are contradictory to their beliefs are necessarily false and wrong. And if they're an intolerant sort of person, they might actually try to shut down these people that are saying what is false and wrong. So mainly it's just saying that a monk is not just like stuck in like theoretical ideas. That he's dealing with reality, especially if he's an enlightened sage. No longer caught up in the mass of words. He's not making judgments. So, let's see here. Yeah, I mean, if you really don't want the word nibbana misused, then you just can't use the word nibbana. Because nibbana is a samsaric word. Just sort of like the word verb is a noun. And so it's like you can't really insist that a process be dealt with only with verbs, because just the way the human mind works, it divides things up into subject and predicate, into noun and verb, into temporal aspect, or like spatial aspect and temporal aspect. It's just like this weird quirk of human mentality. And language is just caught up in that. Might be unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. So if you don't want like delusional ideas about nibbana, you just don't use the term, because it's unavoidable if you do. And I should probably move on to the next question. And we're getting close to the bottom here. Fear not. Although you guys have the advantage of, you can just look down at the bar and see how many hours the whole thing is and how far we are into it. You got the advantage on me on that one. So anyways, next question is from Rui. And up till this morning, this was the last question. But then somebody is squeaked in. You know, it's like in the movies when the big metal door is coming down. You got the person that just kind of slides or rolls under right at the last minute. Last questions are like that. So anyways, Rui says, do you think disquiet would be a viable translation for dukkha? And I mean, I've never seen disquiet used in a translation. We're lagging again. I've never seen disquiet used as a translation for dukkha. I do think there are probably better translations for dukkha. I think my own preferred rendering of unease. I mean, it's similar, disquiet and unease. You know, there's a heck of a lot of overlap. You know, being ill at ease. You know, so yeah, disquiet, I guess, but I mean, disquiet is kind of a laughable term for like unbearable agony. Unease, I guess, also. I mean, that's why suffering is usually used. Suffering, I mean, it has its faults, but all in all, it may be, I mean, it's one of the best translations in English. I prefer suffering to Ajahn Tanisaro's rendering of stress. Venerable Ajahn Tanisaro, I think he always translates dukkha as stress, unless maybe it just obviously means like physical pain in that context or something, then he might render it as pain. But I mean, if you want to use disquiet and it works for you, then it's your call. Although I still prefer unease, and even just suffering, the usual translation, still it's fairly workable. It still works. And I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is our last questioner, but he asked 3 questions. This is 5th, although really he's last, as I just mentioned. Fifth says, in episode 36, that's quite a while ago. In episode 36, you mentioned you were under investigation by Burmese secret police at one point. What was the reason that you think you were under suspicion? Well, yeah, that was fairly obvious. I knew exactly why I was under suspicion. There was this mind-blowing rascal of a monastery attendant who was, among other things, stealing stuff from the monastery and selling it in town for his own personal profit. He was cutting down teak trees and then selling the teak in town, or just like pilfering things from the monastery that people had donated and selling them in town and pocketing the money. And so, I mean, especially with regard to cutting the trees, I scolded him, I warned him, told him to stop doing it. A couple of times I was just yelling at him, just stop cutting down the trees. And he'd be, oh, this isn't a useful tree. This doesn't have any fruit on it or anything. It's like, it was like a wildlife refuge, and it was literally illegal to be cutting green trees in that area. But he just kept doing it. And because he was like a monastery attendant, people weren't on his case except for me. I was definitely on his case. So finally, I just kicked him out. I just threw him out of the monastery, just in a rage that time. I mean, I was so angry at him at that time. I left for something. I had to go get my visa renewed or something. I come back and there's like stumps everywhere. He just went nuts, cutting down just so many trees he had chopped down in this wildlife refuge. And then he was just selling the wood and pocketing the money for his own use. So I was so mad at him that time that, I mean, I had forgotten how to speak Burmese. I was too angry to remember how to speak Burmese. So I was, in a way, I was almost just bellowing at him incoherently and just chased him out of the monastery and wouldn't let him come back. And so he had his heart set on living at that monastery. You know, his family had been supporters of that monastery for decades, apparently. And he just felt like he had authority over the place. That's one reason why he just kind of ignored my warnings and scoldings and so forth. And so after I kicked him out, and it became obvious that I wasn't going to change my mind, because his first strategy was just try to ease his way back in again. You know, wait till I wasn't mad at him anymore and ease his way back in. But he just didn't know me very well. That wasn't going to work. Because he was just a complete, I mean, it was just mind-blowing. Because on one hand, I mean, he's insisting he wants to live at a Buddhist monastery. You know, he was living there, just being like the monastery attendant. And every night he'd be like chanting, you know, metta to all beings and reciting Abhidhamma and so forth. Well, at the same time, he was just this outrageous crook of a guy. You know, it's some kind of dissociation between the religious part of his mind and just the crook part of his mind. So what happened was, after he realized I wasn't going to let him come back, he just went to the military dictatorship, the local office of the federal government in town, and reported me as a political agitator. So I was under, investigation on political charges by the Burmese secret police, like the military intelligence and stuff. But they could see clearly enough. I mean, I'm living alone in a forest and just minding my own business. A lot of the time, not even coming out of the cave to meet visitors. So it was pretty obvious that I wasn't really a political agitator. So, I mean, they did a reasonably good job of investigating me, and they saw that it's hardly likely that I was a political agitator. I mean, if I was a Burmese citizen, they might have just arrested me anyway, just to make sure. But being a U.S. citizen does have its advantages. You probably have more rights in Burma as an American citizen than as a Burmese one. But yeah, that's the reason why I was under suspicion, was just because this rascal of a crook trying to get me kicked out of the monastery, trying to disappear me so he could move back in, just went to the military dictatorship central office in town and reported me for being a political agitator. So I'm just going to move on to fifth's next question. How long did it take you to get comfortable with longer meditation sessions? Well, before I became a monk, it was a struggle to sit for 30 minutes. I'd have like this kitchen timer. I'd set it for 30 minutes and I'd light some incense. And it was just a struggle. I mean, my mind is very restless, kind of a supercharged kind of a mind sometimes, especially when I was younger, just kind of nervous restlessness, a lot of agitation. No, what is it called? Udacha. That's the Pali word. Udacha. Okay. So just kind of restless agitation. My mind was subject to that. And so it was a struggle just to sit for 30 minutes. I'd light an incense stick and then I'd think, man, this is taking forever. I'd open my eyes and like the incense stick wasn't even halfway burned down yet. You know, it was difficult until I became a monk. And then when you become a monk and it's like, it's my sacred duty to do this. It's like your perspective changes and your motives are like kind of, I don't know, what's the word? Just kind of reinforced. You know, it's like, I've got to do this. It's no more just kind of dabbling, being amateurish. It's like, this is my sacred duty. I'm going to strive for enlightenment. And so you just muscle through it, you know? So it became way easier after I became a monk. You know, I could sit for 2 hours. I didn't do it very often, but I was able to do it in full lotus. So, but it wasn't always necessarily comfortable. It's just that when your motives change, your perceptions change, then it just becomes more doable. It's like the story I told about my father. His legs started turning black when I was a kid. So we went to the doctor and the doctor said that he was a longshoreman. He loaded logs onto ships as a profession. And one of the logs rolled over his leg and crushed his leg a little bit. And there was capillary damage in that leg. And my father smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day. And so it was tar building up in these damaged capillaries that was causing his leg to turn black. So the doctor told him, you have 2 choices. You can stop smoking or we're going to have to amputate your leg. And my father had tried to stop smoking on numerous occasions. You know, he'd stop, then maybe after a month, you know, he'd start chewing a little tobacco, maybe start smoking a pipe. And next thing you know, he's back to two packs of cigarettes a day again. But then all it takes is this change in circumstances. And it's like, once it was clear to him, the choice is stop smoking or have one leg. Then all of a sudden, even though the addiction urges and so forth were the same, it was just easier to resist. And it was kind of like that becoming a monk meditation for a half hour, just sitting still for half an hour is like this Herculean effort as a layperson. If you're at a meditation retreat when you don't want to be shamed by being the first person to just get up and walk out, you know, you can't hack it when everybody else can. I mean, that kind of modifies your intentions or your motivations also. But it was just it just kind of automatically happened when I became a monk, or once or twice at a meditation, you know, the few meditation retreats I attended before I became a monk, where it's just, the situation has changed now and just quitting early is no longer an option. So you just stick through it and then it just gets easier because you're just used to it and it becomes more or less habitual. So the last question of this Q&A, also from Fifth, who is also last. Any tips on someone relatively new to Vipassana meditation? ? It seems like sometimes during a meditation session, I get really in the zone and then I just lose it. It's kind of like off and on. I'm sure I just need more practice, but I can already see it's improving my mood throughout the day. So the actual question here, any tips on someone relatively new to Vipassana meditation? Well, it helps to go to a retreat. I mean, it can help. It usually does to attend a formal retreat with a meditation instructor. And like I was saying just a few minutes ago, you have kind of a peer group pressure of, you sit there like everybody else is doing. You don't want to be the wimp, the only person to get up and walk out because you can't hack it. That kind of thing. Thought there was a dog under me. But let's see here. Yeah, I mean, the whole thing with vipassana is whatever arises, you note it and let it go. Satipatthana. I really don't like the term vipassana meditation because it's not really what it is. Vipassana is something that arises spontaneously, often as a result of meditation, but sometimes it has, it's not the result of meditation, or it can even be the result of samatha meditation. So, I mean, that's just kind of a niggle. I don't particularly like the term vipassana meditation. I would prefer mindfulness meditation or satipatthana meditation. And the whole purpose of that is whatever arises, you note it. It's like you hate meditating. You're having like these feelings of just, oh God, I hate this. You just observe it and let it go. Your knee hurts, observe it and let it go. You're wondering what that noise is outside, you observe it and let it go. Ideally, you hear the noise, it's just like the sound goes in and just remains unprocessed auditory data and just goes out the other ear. I mean, you just watch it go by. The watching part is itself going to eventually be transcended by just seeing without making any effort to watch. It's just effortless seeing. That's even better. But really, it's just whatever arises, you just note it and let it go. You get pissed off, note it and let it go. That's kind of tricky because, it's like, it's not just going to go away. You're going to have to note it and let it go repeatedly, especially like pain in your knee. I mean, that can just become the whole meditation. Pain. It's like when I was at Panditarama, that was one of my main meditation objects is, you're sitting several hours a day for 2 months, especially after the first couple weeks. You got an ankle screaming in agony, or a knee or a hip joint screaming in agony, or you're starting to get like a bed sore on your behind from sitting so much that hurts like a son of a bitch. Then, I mean, you just watch that, and I mean, you're not fighting against it. That doesn't help. That's not meditation. You just observe it and observe it. What does it feel like? It's just, it's sort of like after a while you realize that the dislike of the pain, which is actually causing the suffering, is different. And I mean, you can just observe it. Like it just becomes like a flashing red light or something. Still hurts, but it's like you've kind of overcome this automatic reaction of aversion. But I mean, at first you just have to watch the aversion for the pain. You watch the pain, you watch the aversion for the pain. So, yeah, I mean, that's really what so-called vipassana meditation is about. I mean, it's like usually you'll be sitting there watching your breath, and then if anything else comes up, anything more noticeable than the breath comes up, then you watch that, you note it, you let it go. And then when that has run its course, which might be, I mean, if it's just wondering what that sound is outside, I mean, that just might be a matter of 1 second. Or if it's the pain in your knee, it could just be the whole rest of the meditation session. But I mean, you just note it, you just observe that. What does it feel like? What's it, what are the characteristics of this? In a way you can kind of deconstruct it, especially in the early stages of meditation, kind of beginning level. But he says here, I get really in the zone and then I just lose it. It's kind of like off and on. Yeah, it was like that for me also. I mean, the offs and the ons are going to gradually get better. Your best will continue to get better and your worst will generally probably get better. But you just stick with it. It's like your sacred duty. I mean, if you look at it that way, it makes it easier. So I guess I kind of rambled about that for a few minutes, and I guess I sort of answered it. So I guess we're done, by golly. And it's still technically less than 3 hours. Although it'll probably be more than 3 hours by the time I'm done saying the usual stuff at the end, like as I should usually say at the beginning, and have said only once to my knowledge. If you think I can answer a question about Dhamma or Dharma, early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Buddhism in general, meditation, Burma, my own life personally. No questions about my genitalia, please. Then feel free to ask. No more than 3 questions per person per episode, please. And like and subscribe if you find anything of value in this. And check out the URL links below, which would include links to my books. And I am working on a 4th one. I can't make any promises with that at present, however. And last but not least, be happy.